Hi everyone. If you're new, welcome aboard. If you're a regular, welcome back. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Let me know in the comments. Now relax and enjoy the stories. I've been a cop for almost 10 years now and a homicide detective for 3. Over the years, I've worked with some excellent officers and some who weren't so great. But there's only one guy I ever worked with who truly embodied what it means to be a cop. I know the term blue blood gets tossed around a lot, especially with the TV show, but in reality, there are only a few of us who are born for this line of work. And no, I'm not talking about that need to control people. Although, believe me, I've come across a few of those. It was more like he was just born to be a detective. He had a cold, analytical approach, but with a curiosity that drove him. He was sharp, but never arrogant about it, and above all, he was meticulous. He'd leave no stone unturned, working through every possibility until only one logical conclusion remained. It was pure deduction, but every so often, he'd pull off something extraordinary, and it was his method of interrogation that really set him apart. I only got to witness it firsthand once, but it was like watching an artist in action. I won't drop his name, though, so we'll just call him Blue Blood. I'm not a true crime writer, so I'll keep most of the details brief, but here's the one time I watched Blue Blood do what he does best. Right after Thanksgiving in 2001, a body was discovered just outside Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, near the White Rocks Trail, for those familiar with the area. The victim was a 20-year-old woman who had been driving home with her father late on Thanksgiving night after visiting family. According to the father, they'd argued during the drive, and she demanded that he pull over and let her out. Fearing an accident if he didn't comply with his daughter's frantic demands, he stopped and let her out. That was the last time he saw her alive. He admitted that he'd been angry with her and had briefly considered driving off and leaving her behind. But after a few miles, he pulled over, used his old cell phone to try calling her, hoping she'd want to ride home, as it was a long walk back to Mechanicsburg. She didn't answer and sent all of his calls to voicemail. Assuming she'd find her own way, he left the area. A couple of days went by without any sign of her, so he filed a missing persons report. 2 days later, her body was found. She was fully clothed, with her head wrapped in a plastic bag. The search team that found her knew better than to disturb anything, so their initial guess was that she had been suffocated with the bag. But when they tried to move her body, they realized the bag was the only thing keeping her skull intact. They told us it looked like her skull had been smashed by one strike from an extremely heavy object. Think a fully loaded dumbbell or something. They also discovered she hadn't been wearing any underwear at the time she'd been murdered. Uniform officers canvassed the area, including some fairly secluded homes out near White Rocks. They found one guy with priors for indecent exposure and battery. They actually admitted to seeing the girl. She had apparently knocked at his house, told him someone was following her, and asked to come inside. He then invited her in, but she became skittish, changed her mind, and ran off back down his driveway. Almost everyone involved thought it was an open and shut case. We just had to work the guy with priors until we either cracked or we found solid DNA evidence, but old Blue Blood didn't like the guy for it. At least not until he could tie up one little loose end. And when he started pulling on that one little thread, the whole sweater came falling apart to everyone's complete amazement. So what Blue Blood wanted to know is why they were out near White Rocks in the first place. I won't bore you with the nitty-gritty of rural Pennsylvania highways, but the area the father and daughter were in was basically a cul-de-sac. If you were driving from Gettysburg, where the relatives were from Mechanicsburg, you wouldn't end up on those little back roads. Not unless you were totally lost, which was impossible. By his own admission, the father made round trips to Gettysburg 3 or 4 times a year. Therefore, he knew it well. B had taken several wrong turns. Not likely, but feasible given that they were in a state of distress while driving at night. Or C, the mystery reason. That's not my phrasing, by the way, that's old Blue Blood's. He was convinced there was another reason they were out near White Rocks, and he was determined to find out what it was. Following his lead, we end up questioning a handful of people closest to the father and daughter. As you can imagine, the first person on that list was the girl's mom, but she was out of the picture for some reason. Friends and relatives had no idea why she'd abandoned the family, and when we asked the girl's father, he respectfully declined to talk about it. They hadn't spoken in years, and he had no contact details for her. All he could say was that her best bet was asking her elderly parents who lived up in Minnesota. But it was during one of those interviews that Blue Blood mentioned something to one of the mom's friends about the father-daughter relationship, as he put it. Stepdaughter, she said. That was the first time we'd heard that term used. Not a single person either knew or cared to tell us that the father and daughter were not blood relatives. And when the father had married into the family when the daughter was still very young, he'd taken the mom's name instead of her taking his. That was the switch. On the drive back to the precinct, Blue Blood had this look in his eye that reminded me of hunting trips with my grandpa. He was quiet, focused, very visibly tense. Not because he was stalking a deer with a whiny grandchild threatening to screw the whole thing up. It was because he was thinking. He was thinking about why a man would change his last name to fit the family he just married into. And sure, I wondered that too. I mean, the guy is free to do whatever he wants with a reason. This is America. So as strange as it was, I didn't see how that could ever be a piece of the puzzle. But the Blue Blood, it was an unturned stone, so to speak. A loose thread that kept getting longer and longer the more he pulled it. He didn't share his initial suspicions with me, and I'm not surprised because I was dead set on our guy with priors being the guilty party. No. He waited until we had the father in for a second round of questioning to drop his own home-brewed bombshell on him. Like I said, we'd already spoken to the father maybe 3 or 4 times before that point, and each time had been informal and friendly. But then Blue Blood makes up some excuse about needing an official statement from him. So he'd have to come down to the precinct so we could tape the conversation. Just a formality. You'd be doing me a personal favor, he said, and the father obliged him. When we were in the interview room, things started as they normally did with a father. All platitudes and well wishes. The father would thank us all for what we were doing, and Blue Blood assured him we'd catch the person who killed his daughter. Only that time when he said it had this strangely different weight to it. And for dramatic effect, he left a little pause after he said it. That's when I realized something was going on. I mean, I already knew because Blue Blood had called him in for questioning and something definitely was up. But him using the term daughter instead of stepdaughter kept it in the dark in terms of what we already knew. And that's when I realized that something was about to go down. So like I said, the interview started pretty regularly with the father at ease. Well, as at ease as you can get for someone still grieving their daughter. Then, as we're going over the dad's version of events, just one more time for the record, the dad repeats the thing about him stopping to call his daughter's phone. This was supposed to explain why the 16 to 17-minute drive from White Rocks to Mechanicsburg had taken him more like 35 minutes. Blue Blood presses him on this and makes him state for the tape that he wasn't sure how long he stopped. But he drove straight home when he got back on the road again. Blue Blood interrupts in the column, a liar. And in the second that followed, I'm pretty sure I hear the soft thunk of all the jaws in the observation room hitting the floor. The father is obviously pretty outraged and demands an explanation. But all Blue Blood says in response is, "You need an attorney," and suspends the interview so the dad could get one. Everyone thought he'd lost his mind. I remember his ex-partner fishing out his coffee flask out of his jacket pockets and giving it a sniff on the off chance it had vodka in it or something. Blue Blood was a good cop, and we knew we thought outside the box sometimes. But the screw-up what we thought would be an easy case was beyond the pale for many of us. If it was anyone else, the boss would have suspended the interview and switched up the questioning officer. But because it was Blue Blood, no one said nothing. And when the guy's attorney showed up, they just kept rolling the tape. Obviously, because of the implication that the father had lied to us, I'm pretty sure Blue Blood was about to accuse him of having some kind of involvement in his daughter's murder. But the angle he took when the interview recommenced honestly had me questioning reality. Blue Blood basically started listing off all the guys that the daughter had been involved with over the past few years. He said he pulled a whole bunch of raunchy messages from a laptop that they from her after going through her AOL Instant Messenger. Said since the daughter had such an active romantic life that it was entirely possible that it was one of her lovers that murdered her. Blue Blood then implied that the father somehow knew this was the case and was wondering why he hadn't mentioned any of the daughter's partners. But there was just one problem with this from where I was standing. It was all complete nonsense. He hadn't pulled anything like inappropriate messages from the girl's laptop. And aside from a few clues into the conversations that seemed to show some sort of rocky father-daughter relationship, it was completely clean. I thought the gravy had slid off Blue Blood's biscuit. I really did. I kept the faith when he'd accused the dad of lying and he could just smell a lie sometimes. But coming at the case from a completely different angle now, there was an attorney in the room. It certainly didn't feel like we were singing from the same hymn sheet anymore, if you catch my drift. But there he was, just making stuff up about hookups with Taylors and Chads. How Bryce liked to drink and Tommy's teacher said he had a violent streak. Just lighting up the dad with a barrage of just complete fiction. And although he wasn't saying anything on the advice of his attorney, you could see something twisting up inside of him. But I'd never have guessed in a 1,000,000 years what that thing was. Because out of nowhere, the dad's demeanor totally changes. And he goes from confused and mad to just furious. Furious like he was about to leap across the stable because Blue Blood's words had just triggered something inside of him. She was not seeing anyone. The guy screamed it out so loud even his attorney jumped, and like I said, I was getting ready to put him in a chokehold if he decided to lunge for Blue Blood. But he didn't. And as soon as he opened his mouth, Blue Blood shut up and didn't talk again until there's a seriously uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. I can't remember what he said next, not word for word. He was way smarter than me and had the gift of gab, as they call it. But he basically said, no, she wasn't seeing anyone. And you know that for certain, don't you, Mr. Ross? When Blue Blood used this guy's premarital name, the father's face changed completely. You didn't let her see anyone because you exercised almost complete control over your stepdaughter's life. Your possessiveness had you initiate a relationship with your adult stepdaughter, and for a while, she went along with it. But she had been looking at colleges, hadn't she? You were terrified of losing her, and that was something you couldn't allow. You couldn't bear the thought of anyone believing she wasn't yours. That's why you changed your name, isn't it? You couldn't stand the idea of anyone thinking she wasn't really your daughter. Your wife wouldn't take your name, not after her first marriage fell apart so badly. Nothing could change her mind. So you changed yours. As Blue Blood kept pressing him, the father started to lose control. His face went red, and his body shook with rage. Just as his lawyer was about to intervene, he finally snapped. She was mine. She was always mine. And now she'll be mine forever. The tension hung in the room, and Blue Blood let the silence drag on before wrapping up the interview. The father never fully confessed, but by shifting the focus onto him, we were able to gather more than enough evidence to lock him away for 50 years. At the time, I thought it would be a major story in southern Pennsylvania, but the post-9/11 news cycle had everyone distracted, and the case didn't get the attention it deserved. I wasn't surprised, to be honest. I'd seen even bigger stories buried for reasons I couldn't understand. But what bothered me more in the weeks that followed wasn't the media's treatment of the case. It was the way it changed me as a cop. I realized that, for my entire career, I'd let my own biases and emotions affect my work. In law enforcement, you can't afford that. You have to approach every case like a machine. Only the evidence matters. Not the past, not who the people involved are. And we like to believe that families are safe, loving environments. That only clearly bad people commit crimes. But that illusion disappears when you become a homicide detective. After that, the way you view the world is never the same. The instant I fastened the vintage necklace around my neck, I had no idea I was marking myself as a target. It was beautiful, delicate, and seemed harmless enough. But some things are too good to be true, and this piece of jewelry was about to turn my life upside down. My name is Sarah, and up until a week ago, I was just another face in the crowd. I was a 28-year-old graphic designer, living in a small city apartment with my cat, Milo, and an occasional online shopping habit. That's where everything started, with a late-night scrolling spree and what seemed like an innocent purchase. I had been browsing a local buy-and-sell site, searching for quirky accessories to spice up my wardrobe. That's when I spotted it. A stunning Art Deco necklace featuring an intricate silver pendant and a deep blue stone that shimmered in the photo. The seller, Karen, had listed it for a surprisingly affordable price. Without hesitation, I clicked buy now. Karen and I arranged to meet the next day at a local cafe. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with a warm smile and an easygoing demeanor, nothing out of the ordinary. We chatted over coffee as she handed me the necklace. "It's been in my family for years," she said, her voice carrying a subtle undertone I couldn't quite place. Sadness? Relief? "I hope you'll treasure it as much as we have." I promised I would, paid for the necklace, and we parted ways. On my walk home, I couldn't resist putting it on. The weight of it against my collarbone felt perfect, like it was always meant to be there. That evening, I wore it to a friend's birthday dinner. The compliments were endless, and I reveled in the attention. It wasn't until I was walking home later that night, the streets eerily quiet and dark, that I first felt it, the sensation of being watched. I picked up my pace, glancing behind me. Nothing but shadows and the distant glow of streetlights, but the feeling wouldn't leave. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was almost running. That night, I triple-checked the locks before I went to bed. Milo curled up at my feet, and I dismissed the unease as nothing more than too much wine and an overactive imagination. The next morning, everything felt normal again. I got ready for work, absent-mindedly slipping the necklace on once more. It really did go with everything. It wasn't until lunchtime that things took a strange turn. I was sitting at my desk, scrolling through my phone, when a message from an unknown number popped up. * nice necklace. It suits you. * my hand froze, sandwich halfway to my mouth. I scanned the office. Everyone was absorbed in their own work. With shaky fingers, I typed, "Who is this?" The reply came almost immediately. "A friend." For now, I set my phone down, my appetite gone. It had to be a mistake, a wrong number. But the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. That evening, I couldn't concentrate on anything. I kept touching the necklace and wondering if I should take it off. But that was crazy, right? It was just a necklace. I was being paranoid. I was about to go to bed when I heard it, a soft scratching at my front door. Milo's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the quiet apartment. No answer, but the scratching continued. I approached the door on tiptoe, heart pounding. The peephole showed an empty hallway. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I opened the door. There, on the welcome mat, was a single red rose and a note. It belonged to me. "First, I'll be coming for it." I slammed the door shut, locked it, and slid down to the floor, my back against the wood. Milo came over, butting his head against my hand. I scratched his ears absently, my mind racing. What had Karen gotten me into? I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound. By morning, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. I needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to me. I called Karen, but the number was disconnected. Frustrated, I decided to go to the cafe where we'd met, hoping the staff might remember her or have some information. As I approached the cafe, I saw her, Karen, sitting at an outside table, looking nervous. Relief flooded through me. Finally, some answers. "Karen," I called out, quickening my pace. She looked up, her eyes widening in fear. Before I could reach her, a man appeared seemingly out of nowhere, grabbing her arm roughly. "Inside now." He growled loud enough for me to hear. They disappeared into the cafe just as I reached the table. I burst through the door after them, but they were gone. The barista looked at me quizzically. "The couple that just came in," I panted. "Where did they go?" He shrugged. "Didn't see anyone come in, miss, but I knew what I saw." Shaken, I left the cafe, my hand instinctively going to the necklace. What had I gotten myself into? Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. More texts from unknown numbers, unmarked packages left at my door containing old photographs of the necklace on different women. A man in a dark coat following me home from work. I was a nervous wreck. I considered going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I was being stalked because of a necklace I bought online. They'd laugh me out of the station. I tried to distract myself with work, but I couldn't focus. My colleagues noticed, asking if I was okay. I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about not sleeping well. It was Friday night when everything came to a head. I was working late, trying to catch up on projects I'd fallen behind on. The office was empty. I live in Casper, Wyoming, and I've spent my entire life here. Every weekend, after a long week at work, I love to hike. It's the one thing that makes me feel connected to the world outside my job at Walmart. 2 years strong. Hold the applause. I'd had a pretty awful Friday, getting chewed out by my manager, so I needed to get out and clear my head. I decided to hike up a ridge near Garden Creek to relax. I stopped to photograph the sun sinking in red behind the horizon when I lost my grip. In trying to get the perfect angle, I dropped my phone, and it tumbled about 20 feet below. Cursing, I descended the rocks and found the phone, thankfully still in one piece except for a small ding. As I retrieved it, I noticed something odd. A rusted metal square inset into the ground, about 4 square feet in size. I approached it and saw a handle just outside the path, hidden from view. This was no ordinary metal plate. It was a trapdoor. Naturally, with nothing too exciting going on in my life, I opened it. Underneath, I saw a set of rungs descending into darkness. I took a deep breath, grabbed the metal bars, and began climbing down. At first, I thought it might be a fallout shelter as I climbed, holding my flashlight in my teeth. There was no label or indication of where it led, but someone could have easily taken it. The echoes and darkness around me grew as I descended, and I realized just how massive the space below was. After about 20 meters of climbing down, I reached the ground and shone my flashlight around in absolute awe. What I saw was an enormous facility, seemingly abandoned for decades. The floor rugs faded orange, red, and brown patterns screamed late 70s. And the green desks with old TRS-80 Model 2 computers and large floppy disk drives confirmed it. There were coffee mugs with phrases like, "Disco is dead," cassette tapes of Rush, and other nostalgic gems from about 40 years ago. It felt like a time warp, and I was thrilled to have discovered the place, though the dark, cavernous space lit only by my flashlight gave me the creeps. There were stacks of neatly organized paperwork, rotary phones, and even a few beanbag chairs by the wood-paneled walls. As I walked through the massive, circular space, I noticed double doors on one wall and pushed through. My eyes were wide with amazement. Beyond those doors was the longest hallway I had ever seen. I could barely make out the end, the light from my LED flashlight struggling to pierce the thick darkness. Lining the walls were over 100 tall steel doors, each with a heavy lock and a small slot for food or viewing inside. A shiver crawled up my spine as I gazed at the heavy locks, and then I caught a faint, unsettling scent of decay. I raised the beam of my flashlight to one of the slits in the first door on the left, peering inside. My heart raced as I saw what was inside. A thin, naked man, standing motionless with his back to the slit, not moving at all. His skin looked almost glossy, reflecting the flashlight in an eerie glow. At first, I assumed him long dead, somehow frozen in place, but his hairless head twitched slightly, as if disturbed by the light, and I fell backwards in shock, covering my mouth with my hand. My mind raced to understand, but questions sprouted endlessly. I saw a slip of yellowed brittle paper glued to the door that read 01AR, and then noticed all of the doors were numbered as well. I peeked in another window and saw a long, empty chamber with what looked like a moving, oily substance slowly climbing the walls. I blinked in disbelief. It was like a living liquid moving against the push of gravity. I actually bit my hand to assure I wasn't dreaming, feeling pain swell in confirmation. I peeked through another window and shouted as a horrific spiral of teeth, similar to a lamprey's, slammed against the plexiglass slit. I stared in revulsion and disbelief. Whatever the thing in there was had to be over 2 feet in diameter, its dozens of sharp teeth twirling against the plexiglass. My mind began to spin as I noticed one of the chambers further in looked to be missing a door, before realizing it was open. It was then I heard the slam echoing from the large chamber I had come from, from that entrance hatch. Something was coming down the ladder with the echoing clicks of the steel rungs. I ran down the hall, past ungodly nightmares locked behind steel doors. The beam of my flashlight illuminated horrible things in those window slits. Teeth, fangs, claws, stretched limbs, and bubbling forms. Things that should not exist. Things that dug into the part of my brain that controls logic and rational thought with strong fingers, ripping it to shreds as I ran down that endless hall. The smell of death grew strong as I passed that one open doorway to a massive chamber filled with corpses in various states of decay. Some mummified, black and skeletal, others fresh and red, some bloated and white with putrefaction. I coughed bile and finally came to another set of doors and burst through. There were flies, cabinets, and lockers, giant reels of magnetic tape lined on the faux wood paneling on the walls. It seemed to be a sort of archive, and I saw a desk to hide under and dove beneath, clutching my knees. Whoever or whatever is now in that hall is getting closer, and I am praying I can hush my breathing when whatever is coming arrives. All I can do now is sit in the consuming blackness of this room and wait. Part 2. Staggered steps approached, each accompanied by a loud dragging sound. I sat under the desk in the enveloping darkness, breathing as slowly and quietly as my panicked body would allow. My clenched hands on my knees tightened as the metal bang from the door bar being pushed forward rang out inside of the black room I hid in from that hall. The dragging sound approached in my direction, no longer accompanied by steps due to the carpeting. The sound grew closer and closer towards me, and I braced myself when a heavy slam rang out directly in front of me. A few seconds later, the double doors clacked again, and I heard some footsteps in the hall. I sat on the carpeted floor of the chamber containing reels and cabinets, shivering in the complete darkness. Whatever had entered had either left discreetly or was now directly in front of me. And just when I was deliberating, crawling out, or making a run for it, my phone vibrated and lit up. As I removed my phone to quickly silence it, the dim light of the screen illuminated the space under the desk, and just outside of that chair gap, the horrific face staring in at me. There were two bulging eyes under a massive bloody hole filled with teeth, and I was about to scream at the thing before realizing it was an upside-down human head. Something had dragged a man's corpse in here and slammed him down on the desk directly across from mine, on his back, so his head was hanging in my line of sight. I caught my breath, realizing whatever brought the body here was likely returning soon. I quickly stood and used my flashlight to grab a few handfuls of papers from random cabinets and desk drawers, and I used the small circular beam to scan the room. There were 8-track players and cassettes, Betamax players and tapes, reel-to-reel tape loops and other storage devices that had existed in that era, nothing beyond. I sneaked slowly past desks and lockers, past the paintings of gray-haired men in polyester suits on the faux wood wall paneling, towards the goal I now stared at in slight relief, those two double doors on the opposite end of the room. The realization that there may be another exit brought the optimistic concept of escape back into my mind, and I made my way over in silent steps. I clenched my jaws as I opened the other set of doors as quietly as possible. Another hallway of roughly 100 doors stretched down in the dark length of the passage. It was as if the entire massive space was mirrored. This facility was absolutely gargantuan. I looked down the long hall with heavy steel doors, knowing that nightmarish things likely were inside of each of these chambers. I took a moment to shine my light on the papers I'd scavenged from the archives of the previous room, and I read, slack-jawed in both amazement and confusion. The papers I held seemed to be internal communications of whatever organization this had once been. I scanned over many references to thermal and ionizing radiation, and experimentation seemingly to prevent lethal radiation poisoning. I flipped through more pages reading about the threats, but nobody mentioned what the threat was except one page where the threat was referred to more specifically by name by the letters USSR. This massive facility was a relic from the Cold War. Only one document had a company title, name, or anything identifying on those green and white banded, perforated pages. A little logo of 3 blocky letters under which was written, Anti-Radiation Kinetics. I stood in the dark hall, beam of light barely illuminating the space, intrigue leading me over to the mirrored first chamber on the left. Unable to stop myself, I lifted the light to the plexiglass slit and peered in. Inside was a thin, naked woman with wet skin. She was hairless and had a sheen like the man in the first cell I had looked into. My heart skipped a beat as I heard the metal doors push open in the previous room. Whatever had taken that corpse was heading towards my direction, with the sound of the dragging body getting louder and closer. I removed my hiking boots to soften the sound of my steps, slinging them over my shoulder as I ran down that hallway in my thick socks, seeing glimpses of more horrific faces and forms. Something gray and heavily veined with 4 large black orbs of spider eyes stared at me, twitching. Another door's window showed a thin figure with a hairless, wrinkled head that was one giant mouth similar to a canine's. The scent of death built as I realized this hall had another open cell. One I now was dreading to realize was a food storage unit for feeding the abominations in this forgotten place. I only knew I had no desire to meet who or what was feeding them. I passed that room, noticing human limbs hacked and piled away from the rotted dead, slowing slightly to observe a few lab coats before exiting quietly as possible to the doors at the end. I pushed again. My heart spilled heavy pounding from my chest to my throat as I realized in absolute horror. The doors were locked. I ran into the awful stench of the massive room stacked with bodies, realizing I was completely trapped. I scanned quickly and found a pile of pasty corpses, wet with decay, and jumped behind the bruised, bloody stack. I pressed my face hard into a hiking boot to filter the rancid stench that was beyond anything I could imagine. I turned off my flashlight and silenced my phone, waiting in the pitch-black silence for the footsteps and dragging sounds to approach the meat locker. I was now trapped inside. Part 3. The sound of meat and bone being chopped filled my ears, accompanied by the sickening snaps, saws, and splashes that mixed with the putrid smell of death. I lay still in silence, hidden in the darkness. The footsteps came and went, delivering the fresh cuts of meat to this wing of cells, swallowed entirely by the consuming blackness. Whoever or whatever was feeding the grotesque creatures in those rooms had either memorized every inch of the place or could somehow see in the total darkness that surrounded us. I waited, stomach growling, for what felt like hours. Then, finally, a good 10 minutes of silence passed. I breathed deeply, gathered my courage, and flicked on my flashlight. The beam illuminated the gruesome chamber before me. The floor was slick with puddled red, soaked in butchered bodies. I was disgusted with myself for realizing, despite the horrific odor of death that had filled my senses, that I hadn't eaten in what felt like an eternity. I needed food and water or I'd lose my strength. Whatever had been bringing fresh kills down here was now heading the other way, so I decided to search the pockets of the deceased. I rifled through jeans, camo pants, khakis, and shorts. There were dozens of bodies scattered around, and plenty of wallets and keys to choose from. I moved away from the butchery and made my way toward the locked double doors. Flashlight in my teeth and boots slung over my shoulders, I tried key after key for what seemed like an eternity, but nothing worked. Frustration turned into despair until I finally felt a key click into the lock. I exhaled in relief as it turned. When I shone the beam inside, I was in awe of what I saw. Giant vats, large cylinders of compressed gases, and glass containers filled dozens of rows that stretched out as far as a football field. Wide metallic tanks lined the walls, reflecting the LED beam of my flashlight. These chambers were massive, about 6 meters in diameter each, and each had a door. The floors were marked with scattered black splashes of dried blood and discarded paperwork, telling a story of chaos. I directed the narrow beam of my flashlight to some of the papers on the tables and floors, frozen in shock when I realized what I was seeing. There were tests of blood pressure, heart rate, and radiation levels, along with packets containing the names of couples and even full families. I flipped through one packet labeled 10AR/11AR, corresponding with the labels on the locked doors. Quickly became clear what was happening here. I read in disbelief as a promotional packet slid out decorated with eggshell blue, orange, and brown squares in an illustration of a smiling family that was oh so 70s, titled ARC, Anti-Radiation Kinetics and You. The informational packet blew my mind. This was a service for perhaps volunteers, but more likely paying families to subjugate themselves to a battery of experiments for the purpose of living through an impending nuclear winter. There was a colored pencil illustration of a child with blonde pigtails in a pink bell dress hugging a cat with the caption, "Sally's cat Tammy is her best friend. That's because Tammy has life-saving genes that can help Sally." I turned the pages in complete disbelief. Not only that this was actually conceived, but in some horrific manner possibly even achieved. I read on in amazement. A similar illustration showed an older man smoking a pipe, smiling, holding a test tube. The caption underneath read, "Tom chose an entirely new protein our top scientists created to take him beyond immunity, possibly extending his life by decades." I thought of the seemingly living black fluid I saw in the other wing. I flipped through the illustrations of double helixes, diagrams, and paragraphs mentioning talents and DNA zippering, gene therapy, and modification. The pamphlet ended showing an illustration of a family smiling, sitting in metal tanks resembling those on the massive chamber's walls. It showed them exiting with a 60-star shine to show improvement on the next frame. It didn't show the things in those chambers. I scrambled through other notes and urgent memos, one describing rapid, uncontrollable, extreme, and seemingly random mutations. I looked at the memo's title reading, "What Went Wrong?" I gazed in awe at the massive facility, the Ark Lab in all its horrific glory, ushering a lucky few to the future to repopulate the world upon the event that never happened, at least not yet. I kept walking through, taking it all in. The small circle beam of my flashlight was barely able to reach the walls and those metal cylinders where couples and families began the nightmarish transformation into what now sat in those cells, feeding on human flesh. I kept walking, hunger kicking me as I saw a desk on which sat a bowl of ancient hard candies. I ran over and ate the entire stale clump, nearly chipping a tooth, and then continued past desks of gyroscopes, blood centrifuges, monitoring equipment, and the likes. I froze upon hearing keys jingling and a press of the metal bar, and I heard the door behind me open. I heard footsteps slap the floor in pursuit as I ran. I realized I had no idea where I was running to. I was stuck. I was about to die. I was about to end up on that pile in the other room. My brain screamed, "Run," and I ran. I made it to the other side of the giant room, to another door made of wood with a knob and chipped screw holes. My pursuer was nearly upon me as I tried the door, twisting the knob and pushing it open. I entered and slammed the door behind me, scrambling my hands on the brass knob and luckily, finding a lock, which I turned hastily. Pounding shook the door on which I leaned low to the ground. I shined the light to find a nicely decorated lobby, quaint and ornamented with rounded furniture, with peg legs in the usually quirky colors of the 70s, far more sinister, lit by that single beam of my flashlight. I saw more pamphlets and plastic holders on the desk, and finally realized this was where their journey began, greeted by a heavily hair-sprayed receptionist. Most importantly, I saw the glowing orange ring on the elevator door's frame. The wooden door I entered from was clearly not going to hold what had discovered my presence for long, so I ran to the elevator, mashing the glowing button. I hadn't even considered the fact that this facility had power, but I realized this could have been my end had it not. I entered the dim yellow light of the elevator, hearing music and a jiggling of keys from outside the door I had come from. Fuzzy jazz flute heavy elevator music played on speakers as my pursuer entered through the wooden lobby doors with wide eyes, reaching out to me with open hands. A normal-looking man, aside from his milky white eyes, perhaps in his mid-60s, ran into the room screaming just as the doors began to close. I slammed the button and watched as the door shut in the nick of time. I breathed deeply and slid to the floor and sat to put my hiking boots back on, exhausted. I finally registered his muffled voice and what he was screaming. "They're loose down there from higher and farther away." The elevator was moving, not up, but down. Part 4. An instrumental version of a 70s song I vaguely recognized fuzzed from the speaker in the elevator as it descended. I stood on a handrail and tried to open the locked ceiling hatch I'd read only existed in older cars, shaking it and hitting the lock in vain. There was soon a muffled sniffling, then scratching from the hatch, then the creak of metal bending, and a small black triangle began to appear from its corner. The triangle grew in size to reveal long, malformed teeth in the gap. Something powerful was prying the hatch open. I rushed to the front of the elevator car and pounded the open door button as sweat beaded my forehead. The music crackled before squealing with a deafening screech of feedback. The noise stopped that thing's act of ripping open the car like a sardine can, and it seemed to retreat. My palms squeezed over my ears, and I slid to the floor until the sound stopped, and a staticky voice spoke to me over the dated speaker system. "Listen, you are in very serious danger." The voice spoke. As I looked up to see long fingers like articulated drumsticks emerge from the shadow, I watched helplessly as they reached from the black opening and returned to prying the roof hatch open. I yelled for help, asking for the man to make the noise that seemed to repel the thing, but it was clear the speaker was merely that, a speaker. There was no phone or intercom device, just open, close, and the 2 floors. I was trying to figure out how to make a last-ditch makeshift weapon. The elevator stopped and the doors slid open. I looked out in utter confusion, trying to understand what I was looking at. There was a road separating 2 rows of housing that extended into the space under an eerie domed ceiling that was painted and lit like a sky. More rows of housing units and streets continued to my right. It was like an overly exaggerated nuclear family suburb with actual white picket fences and astroturf lawns. All of the small houses were Easter egg colors, throwback ranch homes from a different era. I walked out of the elevator, feeling the bounce of the black rubber street beneath my boots, and I hurried to the first house, peering in the windows. It was dimly lit, but appeared to be vacant, and I rushed in the door, which was unlocked, twisting the lock as I heard the metal clang of that thing from the elevator roof landing on the floor of the car. I kept as silent as possible as the long, horrid shadow of the thing walked by the window to my side. My back was to the door, and I stared at the overlapping colored ovals of the wallpaper that opened to a small kitchen. I then noticed the mirror on the wall that revealed a view of out the window behind me, and I finally saw that thing from the elevator. It was horrific, tall and bony, with multiple rows of elongated human teeth spilling out over each other from a massive, gummy mouth under wide white eyes. The nose was a small bump above 2 flaring black slits on the jagged-cheeked face. I realized that if I could see it, it could see me, and I stayed as still and silent as possible when a squeal rang out from the speaker system, scaring the thing that ran deeper into the development. The voice crackled on the speaker as the man spoke again. "If you're alive, you need to listen closely if you want to stay that way." The man spoke. "The area you are in was built to house our clients, in case the anti-radiation treatment went wrong, which it did. I'm the only one left maintaining this place, but I'm close to making it right again. I'm sure of it this time," he said. I realized he must be insane if he thought he could fix anything about this zoo of nightmares. I crept on the olive green shag carpet towards the kitchen as silently as possible. I was getting farther from the door, but could still hear him on the announcement speakers of the enormous fallout shelter. I looked out the kitchen window that was fixed to the massive outer chamber wall. It was like a cutout display that emulated depth with a layered set of photos of rolling hills and trees. I shook my head and reached down to open the kitchen drawers, removing a steak knife I found inside. Use the maintenance hatch labeled a 13 just a bit forward to the left. "You really shouldn't have unlocked that door," the voice said gravely. I gripped the knife and slowly walked to the window looking out to the street, seeing some emaciated form climb out of a window of one of the houses. It walked on 4 pale branches of flesh limbs that twisted and curled like ram horns. Its skin was pocked with patches of sprouting bluish worms that waved slowly, resembling sea anemone. Its narrow head was inhuman and deformed, squeezed in odd places like a tide roast. The head contained 1 bulging eye and 2 quivering circular red orifices underneath, one pea-sized that widened as it sniffed the air, one larger and lined with small sharp teeth. It walked in shaky, lurching movements, as if unaccustomed to its own body. I almost felt sorry for whoever that had once been until I saw it heave and vomit a red splash of bones to the astroturf grass it stood on. It raised its head and choked up a deep bark of sorts, pacing in twitchy, awkward steps. Feedback squealed from the speaker, sending it bounding out of view behind the houses to my right, before the man upstairs spoke again. "I have been feeding them cadavers donated to science. I don't know what you saw, but you need to trust me," the voice said. "Their body seems to crave only proteins they now lack in their current forms." He continued, I mostly believed him, but I have never crossed a bridge that was half completed. I slowly exited that first house on the left, observing the space, noting ladders mostly encased in cement tubes in the far end of the street, and one hatch on the left behind the houses near me in that faux suburban nightmare. The massive space was beyond surreal, magnifying my fear with its attempt to stimulate a pleasant town from the world above. A plastic, Disney-esque community filled with horrific monstrosities that ate human flesh. The earworm melody from the elevator looped in my head as I clenched the knife tight and quietly walked to the next house on the left. I looked in the window to see a bloated head smushing against the glass, fat as a large pumpkin whose flesh stretched so much that only pulpy red tissue was visible in the holes of a human face inflated by tumorous growth. It teetered back and forth, clearly unable to see. The body below giant and lumped with knobs of ropey varicose veins. I wasn't taking any chances going in there. It was alive and therefore clearly able to eat. I continued to the third house on the left, nearly jumping out of my skin when I heard a deep, rattled, animalistic scream from my right. I rushed into the house, quietly shutting the door behind me, gripping the knob tightly in fear as I peered out the window. Seeing no movement, I felt a dragging sound from behind me that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Turning around, I saw a manic, smiling face on a bald human head sliding toward me across the floor. Her wide, staring eyes looked directly at me, above a normal nose, and her toothy mouth shivered in spasms. The body trailing behind her was a long tube of flesh, lined with dozens of small trudging legs that looked disturbingly like those of a human baby. It slowly emerged from the kitchen. I reached for my knife, and as quickly as I could, I opened the door. The thing's mouth stretched open wide, the skin peeling back from its face entirely as its tooth-filled gums snapped forward like a goblin shark's attack. I barely slipped out the front door, but those lunging jaws hit the door too loudly. I saw peering eyes of various sizes blink and swivel on cocked heads from the sides of the buildings, alerted by the sound. The nightmarish earworm from the elevator music looped frantically in my head, and I suddenly remembered it. ABBA's SOS. Just as dozens of monstrous creatures emerged from the shadows, charging toward me. At that point, all I could do was run. Part 5. The screams alone were enough to drive me to the brink of madness as I sprinted down the rubber street of this hellish suburbia. Animal screams, some high and shrill, others rattling gravel, hissing, popping, and even an eerie whooping. Something that might have sounded humorous in any other situation, but not here. I ran, dodging the hideous creatures beyond nightmares, ones that scuttled, bounded, and loped toward me from nearly every direction, even spilling out from the elevator doors. Dozens of them, their massive bony jaws snapping, fat tongues flopping, and wide shiny eyes all focused on me, drawn to my flesh. I saw a hatch labeled 13, just feet ahead on the left, between two houses. I glanced at the small crack under the hatch and saw shadows moving within. I ran past it, untrusting. At the last second, I twisted my shoulder to ram into a slender, pale form charging toward me, screaming, claws outstretched, with dozens of black talons that scraped down its arm, echoing with every movement. Pain ignited in my bicep as I headed toward the congealing splatter of remains at the end of the street. Above it was a concrete tube that housed the steel rungs of a ladder. My feet slammed against the rubber road as I sprinted. Behind me, I could feel my lower legs sliced, licked, and stung by the pursuing horde, right on my tail. I ran toward the feeding tube, just ahead, until something shiny and black tripped me, like the horn of a rhinoceros beetle. I began to fall forward, and everything slowed to a crawl. I aimed my other foot to the left, miraculously not toppling, continuing to sprint to the encased ladder, which was painted to match the sky mural of the dome wall. Puddles of blood splashed as I ran, then jumped, gripping the slick steel rungs tightly to climb as fast as my body would allow. The ladder shaft stank horribly from decades of rot. I felt a deformed wide hand yank me down violently, banging my jaw painfully down on a rung with a stunning blow. I yanked and freed my foot from the boot, and the thing let out a high, gurgling scream as it fell. I heard the falling bodies clang against the metal rungs from the tumbling creatures. I used the few seconds of breathing room to push the kitchen knife's blade all the way down between my foot and the inside of my boot. The blade now extended down from under the heel as a makeshift weapon just as the horde returned angrier. I felt long fingers wrap around my calf and I stomped violently down, releasing a squeal from the elongated fanged face of that thing below. There were dozens of them, screaming things with too many black orbs of eyes and gnashing jaws. I jammed blade into the silhouetted head with a downward stomp and climbed faster and higher into the darkness of the tube. Some of the rungs were slippery with blood, and climbing in the darkness became increasingly difficult. I finally reached the top hatch from which the man had been feeding them, and my beating heart sank down into my stomach. It was locked from the other side. The feedback squeal from the speakers blared, not from above, but just below me to the right, repelling the pursuing monstrosities a bit away from me once more as the voice on the system continued. "I'm so sorry. You know I can't let you leave knowing what you know. All our work would be completely destroyed for nothing," followed by another feedback squeal as the speaker cut out. The slobbering, howling sounds of the horde below entered the ladder well once more, echoing demented screams through the narrow space as they closed in. I stepped down on a few rungs to the source of the speaker sound and reached over in the blackness and felt a large sliding grate that seemed to be the source of the voice. There was one on my left as well, and neither had locks. I slid open the grate that led to the speaker's sound and turned on my pocket LED flashlight and placed it pointing inward towards the voice in that duct on the right. I realized the passage might lead to that blind madman on the speaker. I slid the left one open and climbed quickly inside, removing the steak knife from my boot and using it to lift up and close the sliding vent cover behind me. I crawled away slowly and silently in the darkness as I heard scuttling, then screams through the access ladder well that had been repurposed as a food hatch. I listened with a slight feeling of vengeance as that man's screams wailed through the blackness of the space, as those things devoured him alive. Once I had traveled far enough that I felt confident the light would not be seen, I powered my cell phone on and used it to illuminate the metal passage that seemed to go on forever. I was utterly exhausted, and now finally out of immediate danger, my stomach growled with hunger. When the grate on the end of the ventilation shaft came into view, I exhaled heavily and crawled a bit faster. It was the same sliding kind of the others, and I listened intently, phone screen off to make sure I wasn't seen. Content. I turned it back on, startled by the large face in front of me, a massive painted portrait on the opposite wall. It was the familiar face of that man who had left me to die in that suburban shelter, far younger and smiling as he held the test tube, but clearly him. Wood paneling and a groovy rug of swirled hues of blue decorated the space, filled with lava lamps and stereo receivers, speakers, and a turntable. His office looked more like a swinger's lounge than an office. I spotted the light switch, flicking it on to see the black light lit black velvet paintings of topless women. From the looks of it, his office had been untouched for the past 40 years. I did love that swanky carpet, but the rest was a bit tacky. I shuffled through the papers on his desk, reading a bit before switching off the lights and opening the one wooden door as quietly as possible. I heard saliva-filled, heavy breathing in the dim hallway that the door opened to. There was just one small guide light in the hall ahead. Glowing orange rings trailed down a hall of elevators. Hope flooded back into my heart as I saw the sign labeled ground exit. Another hatch. All I had to do was get by that shadowy shape, scuttling low to the ground with far too many limbs. It was spider-like, 2 sets of back legs and 2 sets of arms, elbows and knees pointed upward, as it scampered about rapidly in the hull. The head shivered in twitching ticks that sent a chill up my spine. An open elevator shaft on the left seemed to answer my question of how it got in here. I was starving and headed back to quietly search the lab of Gabe Reverton, the name on the metal plate on his kidney-shaped desk. I rummaged through the drawers and shelves of some stashed rotten foods, finding the savior of a honey jar, which I once read doesn't spoil. I forced down the entire container, licking my fingers and scouring the shelves for more food, but finding none. I was going to need my strength if I was going to get past that rapidly moving thing that occupied the elevator bay. I scanned the room, noticing a standing flag of orange and brown hues with ARC written in a white wave of echoed outlines. I only then realized how much I was bleeding and ripped the arc flag from the brass pole, slashing it with scissors from the desk to make bandages to wrap my stinging arm and legs. I stared back nervously at the trail leading to the duct and realized time could be short if those things followed my bloody trail. I picked up the brass flagpole, slapping the heavy metal against my hand, gauging its stopping power. I searched memos, emergency protocols in the in and out trays of papers on his desk, reading of elevator reprogramming procedures in case of lockdown, troublesome test results on recent mice and other glimpses into secret workings of Arkansas. There were Polaroid photos of small, horrifying things in small tanks similar to those I'd seen in larger form, still disturbing in miniature. I found a finances sheet and was amazed at the half $1 million cost of the most basic anti-radiation package offered, which grew after shelter property rental, ration packages, and water, power, and heating fees. This had once been a multi-billion-dollar facility, staffed with the top scientists of the era, and serving clients from around the world. I compiled a dossier with the most fascinating papers I found, including maps showing all of the services, client and employee access points, entrances and exits. A quick glance through the papers, and I realized that continuing to search for another way out might be even more dangerous than staying put. I shoved the documents into my pants against my back and tried to mentally prepare myself. I removed a black light bulb, gripping the flagpole tightly, took a few steadying breaths, and slowly opened the door again. I could hear the wet, clicking sound of saliva from the spider-like creature's toothy mandibles. I tossed the light bulb into the elevator shaft, hearing it explode and fragments trickle down deep into the darkness below. The creature scuttled over with thumping steps, peering over the edge to look inside. My heart raced as I seized the opportunity. I ran forward and jammed the flagpole into the creature's fleshy side, pushing it into the opening. It let out a horrible squeal, and I quickly ran to the ladder, climbing as fast as I could despite the burning in my muscles. I climbed higher and higher, wondering if the shaft would ever end. Then, I heard the squeal behind me. It was coming far too quickly. As it neared, I sensed the atmosphere thicken, and I realized I had reached the top. I pushed with all my strength, expecting the hatch to be locked. It wasn't, but it was incredibly heavy. I strained and pushed, and finally, dirt began to spill in as the light of the sky seeped through. I was free. The moon nearly blinded me as I lay on the ground, feeling the dirt and leaves cover the thick metal hatch. To my relief, nothing tried to open it. I took a few deep breaths before I began searching the dark woods for a small boulder. I tumbled it over to cover the hidden hatch. Turning on my phone's flashlight, I inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp, refreshing fall air after the horrors below. My teary eyes glanced at the moonlit trees and the gradients of autumn leaves, warming the scene with their tranquility. Just above the unimaginable horrors I had escaped, I began the long trek back to my car, listening to the peaceful sounds of crickets and bending trees, doing my best not to think about what I had read in the papers or the horrors still lurking. I only wanted to focus on the thought of a warm bath and a soft bed, not the memories of what I had seen in those notes. I tried not to think about the joint founders, Gabe, Barbara, and Calvin, and their 3 other facilities. Late last year, I celebrated my 21st birthday. Along with my friends, my boyfriend's mom wanted to take me out as well. She made a reservation at a bar downtown for Saturday night. The night arrived, and we got caught in major traffic. My boyfriend's mom and I parked in a toll lot and had to walk about 5 blocks to the bar where we were supposed to meet my boyfriend and the others. As we walked, we reached a crosswalk where we had to wait. There were maybe 8 other people standing around us. I was just minding my business when I noticed a girl standing next to me. Honestly, she startled me. First, she seemed to just appear out of nowhere, and second, she was standing way too close to me. It felt almost as though she was trying to huddle into me, like a shy child hiding behind a parent. But instead of hiding, she was just leaning into me with her shoulders hunched. Her hair was black, long, reaching her waist. She wore a long striped dress that reached her ankles, a leather jacket, and sandals. She looked about my age, but she had dark tan skin and black eyes. Her outfit seemed normal, but her behavior was anything but. She kept pinching her nose as though something smelled bad, and she kept glancing around nervously, like she was expecting something to jump out at her. Honestly, she seemed like a frightened animal, but there was a coldness in her demeanor. Her eyes felt empty, lifeless. There was no emotion on her face. Uncomfortable with how close she was, I stepped a few paces to the side. But guess what? She followed and stood right next to me again, just as close as before. I thought it was strange but tried to dismiss it. Besides, the crosswalk light turned green, and I figured we'd go our separate ways as we walked. But no, she followed me across the street, staying as close as she had been. No matter where I moved, no matter how many people were in the crowd, she always managed to get right back next to me, still plugging her nose and nervously scanning her surroundings. She made me feel uneasy. At this point, my boyfriend's mom spoke up, asking the girl if she was okay or if she needed something. The girl replied, "It's not safe." Then, she slowly lifted her head, tilted it slightly, and stared at me directly in the eyes. Her mouth quivered. My boyfriend's mom and I just looked at each other like, what the heck is happening? At that point, I just wanted to get away from this weirdo. It was bad enough she wouldn't stop invading my space and following me, but now she's saying this weird stuff while looking at me? My boyfriend's mom pulls me to her and whispers to me in my ear, "Walk faster and don't look at her. I want to see if she's following us." So that's exactly what I do. And guess what? She follows us all the way to the bar. Despite my boyfriend's mom telling her to please stop, she responded with, "I want to stay with you guys." Despite taking unnecessary turns to see if she would turn to follow us, she would. I was freaking out internally all the way there. We finally get to the bar. We whip out our IDs as quickly as we can, so we can get inside and get away from this girl following us. You guys, she followed us inside and sat at our table, but she sits at the furthest side of the table, and she starts to scoot herself over. But she only moves over when we look away. You turn your head and boom, she's managed to hop one seat closer to you, and she's just staring the whole time with this blank expression on her face. My boyfriend's mom has had it at this point and gets up to tell the bodyguard to make the girl leave. The bodyguard comes, tells the girl she has to go, and she actually starts to argue with him. I didn't catch the whole conversation over the loud music, but I caught the girl asking him why she had to leave and saying that she can sit anywhere she wanted. She began to get really aggressive once he told her that this table was reserved for us and our group that she was not a part of. She got all fussy and looked at me with malice before she got up and stormed out. But she didn't leave right away. She stood outside, looking in at me through the open patio at the front of the bar. She wasn't moving and seemed to care less about the hustle and bustle of the people around her. She stood there for about 15 minutes before finally leaving. There was just this really bad and dark feeling that I got from her. She made me really nervous for some reason, and she just felt wrong. She was probably someone just cracked out on drugs, but it was super creepy, and I hope I never see her again. I work in the garden section of a home improvement store. I don't work the cash registers, and my manager doesn't even let me water the flowers. So a lot of the time, I have nothing to do. This results in me taking really long bathroom breaks, just scrolling on my phone. I know it sounds bad, but it's better than standing around trying to look busy. Today was just like any other, with me wasting time in the bathroom. Nothing unusual happened until my work phone buzzed, almost simultaneously with the stall next to mine. A few moments later, I saw that the guy in the stall next to me had his hand stretched out toward the ground, his palm facing up. At first, I thought he might have run out of toilet paper and was asking for mine. He stayed silent for a while, so I just ignored him. Then, the man started moving his hand uncomfortably close to my leg. I immediately scooted away and started preparing to leave. As soon as he noticed, he hurriedly exited his stall before I could. A few more seconds of silence passed, and I peeked out from the gap in the stall door to see what he was doing. It felt like a scene from a horror movie. Our eyes met. He was standing barely an inch away from my stall door, trying to peek inside. My blood ran cold. If you're wondering why I didn't just open the door and yell at him, I really hate confrontation. I avoid it whenever I can and do my best to stay under the radar. I stood sideways by the door so he couldn't see me. That's when the whispering started. I don't know what he said first, but it sounded like moaning. The next part was clearer. He said something along the lines of wanting to see more of my unflushed toilet paper. I was beyond disgusted. This guy was a total creep, and I was alone in the bathroom with him. My heart was pounding faster with each passing second. I knew I had to stay put until someone else came in. There was no way I was confronting him alone. About a minute later, someone else walked in, and I immediately took that as my chance to wash my hands and get out of there. Thankfully, the presence of the other person made the man stop his creepy behavior. As I was heading out, he briefly blocked my path before stepping aside. The weirdest part was that I don't think he even worked at the store. He wasn't wearing a vest or anything that indicated he was an employee. Our store is pretty lenient about uniforms, but most workers at least wear a vest or something that shows they belong there. He just looked like a regular customer. I am certain I heard 2 phone dings echo in that bathroom. The phones have a signature ring to them, so it couldn't have been a coincidence. Either way, he only started creeping on me once the phone ring made it clear that I was an employee. The situation really creeped me out, and I have been totally unfocused on my work since then. I kept prowling the garden area looking for any man wearing a similar outfit to the creeper. I have an incredibly hard time distinguishing faces, so I probably wouldn't even recognize him if I did see him again. When this particular experience occurred, it was July of 1982 and I had just turned 13. As part of my birthday celebration, my parents took me and several of my friends to see Conan the Barbarian at the new Walk-In Theater in Liberty. This was quite a change from watching a movie from the bed of a truck at the drive-in. Instead of fighting mosquitoes big enough to completely exsanguinate us and trying to be still enough so the big aluminum speaker didn't fall off the side rail of the truck bed, we were able to sit, in air conditioning no less, and enjoy our popcorn and sodas without welts and blood spatters. For several weeks after that, we all made swords out of anything we could find and beat, slashed, hacked, and stabbed the crap out of anything we thought was worthy of being a foe. Mostly, this resulted in a bunch of decapitated weeds and flowers and a few slaughtered spiders. One of my friends got his father's machete, and we spent a happy afternoon seeing which of us could chop a sapling tree down in a single hack. We almost had a fist fight over who got to use it to kill a little snake we found. It disappeared before we had a chance. Conan was the hero of the day for that summer right up until we saw first blood just after Halloween. One day, we decided that we needed to build our own temple of Set, which was Fulsadum's cavernous fortress from the Conan movie. We didn't have a Princess Valeria to rescue, but we thought it would be cool to at least have a cave to stealthily invade. We had visions of tunnels and caverns and underground rooms filled with treasure to steal. After much arguing and discussion, we finally decided that the best location for our imaginary massacre would be at the bottom of one of the steep banks of the river by a sandbar. The following weekend, we all went to the riverbank with our various instruments of destruction. We had a regular shovel, 2 sharpshooter shovels, a hatchet, and a pickaxe. The area that we chose was at a bend in the river that was about a 10-minute walk from the road. The level of the river was low, and it left a great expanse of sandy shoreline in the bend where the sediment had built up into a sandbar that was high and dry when the river level was low. Over the years, the river had cut into the earth, leaving high banks at this particular bend that were maybe 12 or 15 feet above us. It was already undercut to an extent, and we had to clean out the trash and beer cans from previous visitors before we could start working. We spent the following week digging into the side of the bank. We dug a hole about 10 feet deep and then began making our cavern. It was more work than we anticipated, so it was a lot slower than we wanted. We usually worked in 10 or 15-minute bursts, and then we would work on a squared-off berm with the dirt we had excavated to hide the entrance. Before we finally got bored with the whole idea of multiple tunnels and caverns, we had dug a tunnel about 3 feet in diameter and 10 feet deep into the bank of the river. At the end of the tunnel, we had dug out an area that was more of a small room than it was a cave. We made the floor as level as we could in an area that was about 10 feet on each side. The top of the ceiling was probably 8 feet from the floor. We finally stopped at that height because we ran into roots from the trees on the top of the bank, and we were tired of trying to expand it because we kept getting dirt and grit into our eyes and mouths. We thought the end result was awesome. We dug little alcoves into the walls and put candles in them to provide lighting. It went from our own version of the Temple of Set to a little clubhouse. It was really cool inside there when the weather was hot outside. It was even better when the candles lit up the area in a horror movie type of light. And you looked up, you could see the roots hanging down. We were all pretty proud of our accomplishment. We built the berm at the tunnel entrance up to about 6 feet high and made the outside look like it followed the natural slope of the sandbar. The end result was that if you were to walk along the shoreline and weren't actually looking for it, you would more than likely have walked past it without even noticing. This became our home away from home and provided us with hour upon hour of fun and entertainment. We even camped out there a few times that summer. One weekend, we found that our little hidey hole had been used by someone else. When we crawled into our cave, we found several beer cans in a blanket and a pair of socks. Evidently, some of the older teens in the area were using it too. We spent that day discussing booby traps and other means of discouraging the invaders from using our cave, but we finally decided that if we did anything to protect our cave, it would probably result in someone destroying it. Over the next few weeks, we found more beer cans, cigarette butts, a crushed pack of Camels that was empty, a styrofoam cooler without the lid, a frisbee, and a keychain with 3 or 4 keys on it. We put the styrofoam cooler upside down in the middle of the cave and left the keys sitting on it. The next time we returned, the keys had been replaced with a Budweiser that we all took turns sampling and a new box of candles. We had a lot of adventures in the cave that summer. We were Conan in the temple. We were Rambo in the mines. And it was the castle of the crystal from the dark crystal. Then one day, we all met at the cave to find that part of the ceiling had collapsed. An area about the size of a big tractor tire had fallen, leaving even more roots showing. We got an old galvanized tub that was about the size of a turkey pan and tied a piece of clothesline we had liberated to each handle, one leading inside the cave and one to the outside. Me and Jerry would pull the tub out and empty it after Terry and Bobby filled it inside the cave. After it was empty, they would pull it back inside and fill it again. We were about halfway finished when we heard the laughter. At first, we thought it was whoever was using our cave when we weren't. We were a little excited to see who it was, but then we heard the voices that went with the laughter. It was Bubba Hane and his brother, Henry, and a couple of their friends. They were the bullies of our area. They were notorious for being the local toughs. They all walked around with their elbows cocked back and their chests puffed out. They all smoked and talked with language that would have caused me to get beaten half to death and my mouth washed out with dish detergent if I had ever been caught using it myself. Bubba was 19 or 20 and had been in jail several times. He was mean and quick to fight, and it didn't matter if you were half his size. He terrified all of us younger kids. We debated crawling into the cave and keeping quiet until they passed us by. But if they knew about the cave, then we'd only be caught without anywhere to run. So we took off running in the opposite direction of the voices. We climbed up the bank around the bend and circled back to watch from the top of the bank where we were safe and able to run if necessary. As we watched from our elevated vantage point, they came around the bend. Bubba and Henry were pulling a small aluminum boat through the water with a rope tied to the loop in the front. The boat had an ice chest and several flathead catfish laying in it among empty beer cans, and they were talking about finding more fish. Evidently, they were planning to have a big fish fry. Walking along in the front of them were Gerald and Ricky, also known for being less than friendly. They were both walking in the water about chest deep along the far side of the riverbank. They were all wearing cut-off shorts and drinking beer. Ricky would stop occasionally and feel the wall of the bank under the water. As we watched, he disappeared under the sandy water for several seconds and then surfaced again and said, "Nothing." And they continued walking. They were talking about which girls would be at the event and who they hoped would come and who they'd like to hook up with. They were noodling for fish. Noodling is one of those activities that can be both exciting and dangerous. The way it works is you look for where a catfish or natural erosion has made a hole in the bottom of the riverbed, usually on one side or the other as the current isn't as strong there. The person doing the noodling will stick his hand into the hole and feel around for a fish. If a catfish is there, it will think the hand is a smaller fish and therefore food and try to eat it. When the catfish has your hand in its mouth, you grab it by the lower jaw or through the gills and pull it out. Obviously, any catfish with a mouth big enough to engulf your hand is a good-sized fish, ranging in size from 20 to 60 pounds on average. The problem with doing this is that occasionally you can get a fish that is actually too big to easily extract and doesn't want to let its lunch get away. It's a struggle to get your hand back and pull your head above the water before you drown. While catfish don't have teeth, their lips are lined with millions of tiny little spikes that can scratch you up pretty badly. Another danger is that you might encounter something other than a catfish, like a snapping turtle. If that happens, there's a real risk of losing a finger. I'll be honest, I'm too scared to go noodling. We watched as Ricky went under the water again. After what felt like 2 or 3 minutes, his hand suddenly shot up from the water and waved back and forth. Gerald immediately dove in to help him, and they surfaced a minute later, sputtering and gasping for air. They caught a big one, about 4 feet long. Henry and Bubba steered the boat toward them, and together they wrestled the fish into the boat. They congratulated each other and toasted to their good fortune with a fresh beer. After a few sips, they continued their journey. Eventually, they were out of sight, heading toward the more populated areas where they lived. We didn't think they'd be coming back, so we jumped back down and resumed our work. Bobby realized they had walked right by our cave and hadn't even noticed. That was fine with the rest of us. About 5 minutes after we started digging through the fallen dirt again, we heard screams and shouts from the direction Bubba and his crew had gone. The sounds were full of fear. Forgetting about the work, we ran around the sandbar toward the source of the screams. When we spotted Bubba and his friends, they were now on the opposite side of the river, and the boat was drifting downstream toward us. Terry grabbed the line as it passed, but he wasn't strong enough to stop it. So Jerry and I grabbed on, and Bobby waded into the water to push the boat from behind. We all figured that helping them would earn us some immunity from any bullying for at least a little while. As we walked the boat back toward them, Gerald was sick in the sand, and Ricky was retching. Bubba and Henry were both pale as ghosts, pacing back and forth with their arms wrapped tightly around themselves as if they were freezing. When they saw us coming, they immediately puffed up, acting tough, with their chests out and elbows cocked. For a moment, I thought we'd made a mistake thinking they'd appreciate our help. Henry was the first to realize what we were doing and shouted a thankful greeting before jogging toward us. He helped drag the boat up to Bubba and the others. We all stood cautiously, ready to bolt, but no one seemed interested in bullying us. I looked around to see who got hurt, but everyone had all their fingers and toes, and there was no blood anywhere. So I asked what happened. Bubba glanced out across the river, about 60 feet away, but didn't say anything. Henry finally spoke up, saying they thought they had seen a dead body. Gerald turned around, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and spit. "There ain't no thinking to it. I had my hand around its damn ankle," he said. "I reached into that hole and felt what I thought was a tail and pulled on it and came up with a damn sock and shoe." We all looked at the opposite bank of the river, searching intently for any signs of blood and gore, but couldn't see anything. When we asked where it was, Ricky told us that it was about 5 feet down at the bottom of the big catfish hole. We gotta call the police," Gerald stammered. He kept wiping his hand on his pants. He stooped and gathered a handful of sand and washed his hands with it. Bubba told him to call the police if he wanted, but that he didn't want any part of it. Then he looked at us and told us to forget he was there. He told us not to mention his name at all. Then he and Henry turned around and began walking upstream toward where everyone lived. Gerald and Ricky looked back and forth at each other. Nobody knew what to do. Finally, Ricky told Gerald to wait and he'd go call the sheriff and ran off. We all stood there for a minute, half afraid to talk. We knew about Bubba and acted accordingly, but Gerald wasn't as well known to us. We all know who he was and had heard stories, but none of us had ever had any direct contact with him before this. Finally, Terry asked him how it happened and who had screamed. Gerald looked at him with big bulging eyes, still wiping his hands up and down his pants. I don't think he realized what he was doing. He stared for a minute like he was waiting to see if we were going to make fun of him, but we were all half scared of him and wouldn't have dared to poke fun at him anyway. After a minute, he told us they were going to have a big fish fry later. They had been out noodling to get more fish, so they'd be sure to have enough. They were planning to get just one more before they stopped. He looked at us and held his hands at shoulder level, palms facing inward, and shook them vigorously. "Just one more," he said. shaking his hands so hard that water sprinkled on us from his wet hair. He told us that he had been walking along feeling for holes in the riverbed with his feet when he found the hole. He had gone under and felt around with his hand when he felt what he thought was a tail. He said that he grabbed it really hard, ready for the fish to try and swim away when he felt something oozing between his fingers. He told us that he braced his feet and pulled and it just came up. As he told the story, he mimed all of his actions. He told us that just as it was getting close enough to the surface of the water for him to see how big it was, that he noticed it was white instead of the dark gray color. Then he saw the sock and shoe. That was when Ricky saw it and yelled. Ricky's sudden yell startled Gerald, who thought the leg was alive. They both ran to the boat and told Bubba and Henry what they had seen. Bubba didn't believe him, so he and Henry waded over to the hole and found the body. In their rush to get away from it, they lost the boat. After a minute, we came around the bend bringing the boat with us. Ricky came back in a few minutes and announced that the sheriff was on his way. They hurriedly removed the ice chest and empty cans from the boat, and Ricky took everything away. After another few minutes, he came walking back with 2 uniformed men. The sheriff listened as the story was told again. He took everyone's name and address and phone number. He went back to his car while the deputy was asking Gerald and Ricky more questions. Was the body a male or female? Was the body white or black? Was it an adult or a child? Are you sure it was human and not animal? After what seemed like 10 hours to us kids, but was probably less than an hour, the sheriff appeared again. He was walking with 4 other men who were all wearing wetsuits and had scuba gear. 2 of the men started taking a bunch of photos and plotted the area on a map and took more photos from the bank above the hole and from where we were standing and from the opposite bank on our side of the river. As the 2 men took the photos, the other 2 went underwater and confirmed that it was indeed a human body. 2 of the men went back to wherever they had parked and returned with a table and another camera. As they returned, the sheriff told us that we should probably leave the area and stared at us until we took the hint and left. We ran back toward our cave and climbed the bank again, this time circling the opposite direction and sneaking to the edge of the bank overlooking the scene of the excitement. The scuba divers used this second camera to take more photos underwater. They couldn't have been very good photos because the water was only neck deep and they completely disappeared in the murky water. After they finished taking photos, they brought the table out to the edge of the water. The table was actually a large float that 2 of the men held in place while the other 2 went underwater again. I don't know exactly what I was expecting to see, but this thing they brought up out of the river actually gave me bad dreams for a few weeks afterwards. It was evidently a man. His face was swollen, and his eyes and ears were gone. His belly was huge. He was wearing blue shorts and only had 1 sock and shoe. The thing that got me the most was his color. Gerald had said he was white, but he was actually a dull gray color with darker gray and green mottled spots, and he looked slimy. 2 of his fingers were just bone. His mouth was open, and as they rolled him over onto the float, a bunch of nasty water flowed out. As I watched them bring the float back across the river, I began to notice more details that hadn't registered before. The skin on his elbows and knees had been torn away. The sock I thought I saw was actually skin, which had separated when Gerald grabbed the leg and pulled on it, sliding down the ankle. But the part that stuck with me the most, the part that haunted my dreams, was his head. There were no eyes, no ears. His mouth was open, filled with who knows what. His facial skin was so swollen it looked almost cartoonish, but the skin around his chin was missing, exposing bone. From what I'd seen in movies and read in books, I expected the body to be rigid with rigor mortis, but it wasn't. His arms and legs flopped like they were made of rubber, as if the bones had melted. The last thing I remember about the body was what I saw as they carried him away toward the houses. The bottom of his foot, without a shoe, was smooth and white as snow, without a single wrinkle. It was the first time I'd ever seen a dead person up close. Sure, I'd seen countless bodies on TV and in movies, but never in real life. I don't know if that's what caused the bad dreams, or if it was just the condition of the body, but it was probably a mix of both. I never found out who he was or how he died. A few days later, I asked my mom, and after she yelled at me for being near the river, she told me she'd only heard about the police finding a body. A week or so later, we went back to the little cave to see if anything had changed, but it had completely collapsed, leaving a massive divot at the top. One of the trees that had been standing was still there, but at an odd, drunken angle. It had rained, and that was apparently enough to cause the cave to collapse. None of us cared, though. The gruesome discovery had stripped the place of its magic. The following summer, the entire side of the bank was gone, including the tree. Since I was little, despite dealing with occasional insomnia, I've always been a deep sleeper and difficult to wake up. Along with that, I've had vivid dreams throughout my life. I've never been able to master the art of lucid dreaming, though. The moment I realize I'm dreaming, I get too excited and either wake up entirely or become aware enough that I watch my dream like it's a movie. I've never really tried to learn how to lucid dream, though. I've heard that it can lead to sleep paralysis, and for me, my dreams are an adventure on their own. Adding the terror of sleep paralysis just isn't worth it. I already suffer from night terrors and anxiety dreams, so the thought of experiencing one of those while being half aware of my surroundings sounds like a nightmare. Occasionally, when I'm drifting off to sleep, especially during naps, my body falls asleep, but my mind stays partially awake. This allows me to hear sounds around me or even pick up on conversations people are having. While unrelated, it's also when I'm most likely to talk in my sleep if someone engages me. On the rare occasion, I'll be dreaming and can narrate what I'm seeing to people around me. I live with my husband, and ever since my work schedule changed a few years ago, I've had trouble waking up before 9 or 10 a.m. Sometimes, when my husband leaves for work, I'll get up to let the dogs out, bring them back in, and then go back to bed. In my sleepy haze, I sometimes forget to lock the door before going back to sleep. If I'm unsure, I'll get up to check. Other times, I'm so exhausted that I drift back into sleep without checking. Occasionally, my husband comes home early, only to go back to work for his night shift. Sometimes, he arrives just an hour after starting his shift. Since I've grown so accustomed to the sound of his heavy boots on our wooden floors, it usually doesn't wake me up. If I'm in a deep sleep, I won't wake at all. If I do get startled, I just slip into that semi-aware state, feeling him get back into bed, and everything feels normal again. Now, mind you, we live in the middle of nowhere and rarely get visitors, but I still worry that someone might try to break in during the day while my husband is at work. We have 2 guard dogs, but one of them is deaf now, and at the time of this story, the other was a young puppy who wouldn't bark if something frightened him. He would grow silent and still instead. Now, on to what happened a few months ago. It was a typical morning. My husband got up, took a shower, got dressed, kissed me goodbye, and left for work. A few hours passed. I was drifting in and out of sleep, partially aware of the sunlight creeping into the room. Not long after, I passed back out, only to be startled awake by a noise. I heard my husband's heavy footsteps calmly walking around the front of the house. Neither of our dogs made a move or a sound, and the noise level was low enough that it hadn't caused me to fully wake up either. I sat there patiently waiting for him to make his way back to our bedroom so that we could cuddle up and go back to sleep when a horrible thought occurred to me. What if it isn't my husband? Had he forgotten to lock the door when he left? What if this is that intruder I've been worrying about? What if I can't wake up before they realize someone else is in the house? This is when I start to hear the heavy boots making their way down the hallway towards our bedroom. At this point, I think my eyes are open. I can see our bedroom, and I'm watching the door to the hallway, anxiously awaiting to see my husband round the corner to our room. This is when I start to realize these boots don't sound like my husband's, and the terror sets in. I have this horrible sense of impending doom. There's a strange, large man in my house. My dogs are unaware or defenseless, and I am too out of it to get up and defend myself. As the steps reach the doorway, I shut my eyes tight, praying the man will think I am asleep and try to sneak out without being caught. I hear the footsteps pause in the doorway, and I can feel this evil presence flood the room. I suddenly realize he's here for me. The heavy boots slowly make their way over to my side of the bed, and I can feel my weight being pressed down as he leans over me as if to whisper in my ear. I know now that I do not want to know what he is about to tell me. I need to do everything I can to not hear what he is about to tell me. So I did the only thing I could. I strained my ears and caused my eardrums to tremble, causing a deep rumbling sound in my ears. I feel the lightest sensation of his breath on my ear and jawbone as I continue straining that little muscle. He stands back up and exits the room, and I am released from my sleep. I jump out of bed and grab the nearest weapon we have and comb through the house. As you may have guessed, there was nobody there. The front door was locked. Our dogs were undisturbed, but my heart was pounding in my chest. I was drenched in sweat and the fear had me trembling. I placed the weapon back where it belonged and messaged my husband about what had happened, and I later told my sister-in-law about it. My sister-in-law has had a few run-ins with these beings and has done some research on her own. While she didn't share with me what she knew, she said, "It's a really good thing that you didn't let it put things in your head." Her comments made the whole experience that much creepier. What would have happened if I had listened to what it had said? What could it have told me that would have been so devastating to change my life in the worst way possible? Was it going to tell me something, or was it going to command me to do something that I inevitably would be unable to resist? A part of me wishes I knew, but I am very glad that I don't. During high school, I worked as a junior electrician at a large theme park, where I was one of only a few electricians under the supervision of a handful of senior staff. Our job was to maintain and repair the electrical systems of the rides, including the roller coasters. One of the senior electricians, Frank, was my direct supervisor. My role was to assist him with whatever tasks he had. Initially, I would simply follow him around and hand him tools as he worked, but over time, I became more involved and learned the trade. Eventually, Frank would send me across the park to take care of problems that arose on various rides. I worked at the park for 3 summers, so I got to know Frank fairly well. Frank was in his early 50s, thin, with a neatly groomed mustache. He was a man of strong principles, very religious and strictly against drinking or drug use. In fact, he was so devoted that he refused to work on Sundays. One day during the 3rd summer, I showed up for my usual shift and went straight to the electrician's station. Frank was already there, engrossed in paperwork. He greeted me, then told me to take my toolbox and head over to the kiddie ride section to handle a repair. I gathered my things, about to leave, when Frank called my name. I turned around, expecting him to give me some extra instructions. What happened next has stuck with me. Frank looked at me with a vacant, emotionless stare. Nothing like his usual demeanor. Something was definitely off. I asked, "Yeah, Frank." He locked eyes with me, and in a completely monotone voice, much different from his usual tone, he said, "The Space Indians are coming." I froze, staring at him, completely bewildered. Frank maintained his gaze, then suddenly snapped out of it, returning to his paperwork without acknowledging what had just happened. I tried to brush it off, asking, "What's that?" as if I had misunderstood him. He didn't respond, but in his usual voice, told me to hurry up and fix the kiddie ride. I reluctantly did as I was told, but his strange words and expression lingered in my mind for the rest of the day. I had no idea what Space Indians meant or why Frank had said it. Eventually, the incident faded from my mind, and the weeks that followed were uneventful. But then, near the end of summer, the oddity resurfaced. One morning in late August, I arrived at the park to find Frank standing in the parking lot, staring at the sky. This caught my attention because Frank was always the first to arrive. He had never been late during the entire time I had worked there. I approached him casually, greeting him with something like, "Morning, Frank." He slowly turned to meet my gaze, and I felt a rush of unease when I saw his expression. It was the same vacant look he had given me weeks earlier when he mentioned the Space Indians. We stood there, locked in a stare for a few moments, and then he spoke in the same monotone voice as before. "The Space Indians are here now. It's too bad." Without another word, he turned around and walked off, heading out of the parking lot. I asked where he was going, but he didn't answer. He walked down a side street and was gone. I never saw him again. A week later, I was assigned to a new senior electrician. Curious, I asked him what had happened to Frank. The new guy looked at me like I was speaking about a stranger. I even asked the head of the hiring department, who told me that no one by the name of Frank had ever worked at the park. To this day, I'm left puzzled and disturbed by the whole experience. This happened a few years ago when I was about 15. It was pretty typical at the time for my family and the families of my two best friends to go out for dinner together. On one of these occasions, my friends and I decided it would be cooler and more adult to sit at a separate table away from our families, just to eat and chat. We were a couple of teens having a fun night. That's when one of my friends, Jenny, whispered that the guy at the table next to us seemed to be staring at me. I turned my head slightly and noticed that he did seem to be looking our way, but I dismissed it. I mean, we were at a restaurant. People look around all the time, so it seemed harmless enough. As time went on, my other friend, Gabby, also noticed the man staring at me. We started feeling a bit uneasy. He'd finished his meal quite a while ago, but he just sat there, watching us, especially me. The guy looked to be in his 30s, and his expression was starting to creep all three of us out. But we didn't want to jump to conclusions, so we decided to ignore it. Eventually, the man paid and left, and we felt a sense of relief. But the second I took my first bite of food, Jenny gestured to me frantically. We were sitting by a window, and it turned out that, even though the man had left the restaurant, he hadn't actually left the premises. He was standing outside, staring at me through the window. At that moment, we realized this wasn't normal behavior, but we didn't want to cause a scene in front of our families. So we kept eating, but our eyes were glued to the window. By the time we finished our meals and paid the bill, the man was still standing outside. We were worried he might try something, so we stuck close to our dads as we made our way out. He followed us from a distance as we walked to our cars, but after a while he changed direction and left. The whole experience was unsettling, but we tried to put it behind us, thinking it was over, or so we thought. 3 months later, the three of us decided to visit the downtown area of our city for fun. We were standing at a street corner, trying to figure out where to go next when I felt Gabby tapping my shoulder. At first, I didn't respond, but when she kept tapping, I looked up, and I swear, my heart stopped. It was the same guy from the restaurant, but the restaurant had been nowhere near where we were standing now. Yet somehow, by sheer coincidence, we had ran into him again in a city of huge population. The guy made eye contact with me, and I could tell he recognized us. We immediately walked away as fast as we could, and he started to follow, but after a few minutes, eventually, we did lose him. We tried to then continue on with our plans and did end up having a good time, all things considered. However, just when we had decided to head back home, we ran into the guy and one of his friends again. This time, we were really freaked out. He spotted us again, and this time, him and his friend followed us. Gabby said maybe he won't come after us if we go into a makeup store. We tried that, but nope. They walked right inside after us. At this point, Jenny was ready to call the police, but we decided to try and lose them one last time by ducking into a toy store. We stayed in the store for a while and kept an eye out outside. They walked back and forth for a few minutes looking for us. But eventually, they left the area, and we decided now was the time to make our move and leave. This time, we lost them for good, but the whole ordeal was beyond stressful. The three of us never told anyone else what happened. I still don't know what he wanted from me or what would have happened if he had caught up to us. But I am glad I haven't seen the guy since. All these years later, my friends and I think back to this incident and still think about how crazy the odds were to meet this same creep more than once in two completely different, random places. For about 3 or 4 months, my cousin would come over to my house every weekend. We hadn't seen each other in about 3 years before that, and we'd always been like brothers, so I was really glad we were spending so much time together. This happened around 4 months ago, and every time he came over, I'd suggest going for a walk whenever we got bored. I live in a quiet suburb of Victoria, and I hadn't encountered anything strange in at least 5 years, so I never thought twice about taking a late-night walk. It was around 11 p.m., and my parents had some people over, laughing, drinking, and just having a good time, like typical adults do. My cousin and I were in my room playing video games when I suggested we go for a walk. He was used to me asking this every time he visited, so he agreed, and we set out, thinking it'd be just another casual walk around the neighborhood. At the end of our street, we could either go left or right. We chose right, and when we reached the roundabout, there were 4 different ways to go. I decided to go left toward the park at the end of the road. For reference, the park has a basketball court next to it. My cousin didn't live in the area, so he always let me lead the way. We're both loud and goofy when we're together, yelling, making jokes, and being a bit obnoxious, just like typical teenagers. As we walked up the street toward the park, I noticed someone standing on the basketball court. I told my cousin to quiet down because I didn't want to look like a couple of idiots. I figured it was just someone playing basketball since the park is near houses. But there was no sound of anyone shooting hoops. As we got closer, we realized it was a man wearing a white hoodie. He had the hood up and was standing in the middle of the court, staring down at the ground, not moving. I whispered to my cousin, "What the hell?" Then I gestured to the left, back toward my street, and whispered, "Let's go this way." We didn't take our eyes off the guy, and we made sure to stay as quiet as possible. Though, knowing us, we were still probably a little too loud, even when trying to be silent. I was pretty sure the guy heard us, but he didn't react. The guy never turned around to look at us though, and he never moved a muscle. We weren't paying attention to where we were walking and kicked some wood that was laying on the footpath. If talking wasn't enough to get his attention, that definitely would have been. The street filled with the sound of crashing wood. "Fuck," I whispered. I turned back to look at the guy, and he still hadn't moved or turned to look at us, and he was still in the middle of the basketball court. At this point, my cousin and I were creeped the fuck out. I said to my cousin, "Fuck this, let's go home." He agreed, and we got to the end of the street around the bend, and were about to walk down my street. My cousin said to me, "Hey, let's go back and see if he's still there." Me being me, I said to him, "All right, let's go." And instead of going the way we just came, we went to the same way we originally went, essentially doing a big loop, and this is where it got really creepy. Would have been only a minute before we got back to the basketball court, and I looked at my cousin with a what the fuck look, and he gave me the same one. The basketball court was empty. This isn't too strange because he could have simply lived in one of the houses near there and went back inside after we walked past. I asked my cousin what he wanted to do, and he said to keep walking. I said okay, and we started walking past the park. It's a fairly big park, and it has no lights whatsoever in it, so it's pitch black. My cousin jokingly says, hey, let's go through the park." I'm not afraid of the dark, so I said, "All right then." He gave me a strange look, and we were about to walk through. I looked and saw a dark figure, though. Now, there are a few trees in the park, so I assumed it was one of them, but I noticed that this figure was actually standing behind a tree, and it moved very slightly further behind it. I was seriously creeped out, but I didn't want to say anything now, so I laughed and said to my cousin, "Nah, I'm joking, man. Fuck that. Let's go this way," and started walking the way we were going to go in the first place. We walked up the street. It was one straight run for about 15 minutes before we got to the main road. My cousin and I were constantly joking about the guy saying he could be in one of the houses we were walking past or in one of the many houses that were being built at the time. We even went as far as saying he lived in one of the dumpsters that was in the street. We laughed and tried to diffuse how creeped out we were. By this time, we're about 300 meters up the road when I turned around just to see if the guy was following us. He wasn't, but what I saw still sent shivers down my spine. At the very end of the street, just on the edge of the park, I saw him, the guy in the white hoodie still up, looking down the street at us. I turned back around and continued talking to my cousin. I'm sure he was the one behind the tree. I didn't tell my cousin I saw someone behind the tree, though. I didn't want to freak him out, and I didn't tell him I saw the guy staring at us now. My cousin told me he didn't want to walk much further and asked to turn around and go home. There was no way in hell I was going back that way, though, so I made up some bullshit that I wanted to go to the shop that was just down the road. He wasn't happy, but he said all right. The shops are closed at this point, which I knew, but I acted disappointed anyway. So we went along the way home, which took us about 45 minutes or so. When we got back, my parents and their friends were still up talking and stuff, and they hadn't realized we left and didn't realize we came in. My cousin and I went into my room and continued playing video games. We went to sleep about an hour later, and the next day his dad picked him up at about 10 in the morning. But the story doesn't end here. The next weekend, my cousin, like usual, was over at my house. We were talking about what happened the previous weekend when we suggested we go for a walk again. I didn't really want to after what happened, but I reluctantly agreed, and he said he wanted to go past the basketball court again. I said okay, and we were walking towards it when we saw it was very faintly lit up by flickering orange light. We got closer, and I told him I wasn't feeling well. So once again we turned and left and started heading towards my street. We looked in the court, and in the middle was a small fire. What we saw next still makes us uncomfortable. Sitting around the fire were 5 people, all with hoodies on, not moving, not talking, just looking directly at the fire. My cousin and I looked at each other and quietly, but quickly got the hell out of there. I don't know what they were doing, and I don't know if it had something to do with the guy we saw the previous week, but I know my cousin and I never went for walks late at night again. I never told anyone about what happened, and as far as I know, he never did either. What still creeps me out is that this only happened 5 minutes from my house in a seemingly quiet place. We moved since this happened, but our new house is only up the road from the old one, and that guy and those fire weirdos live in the same area I do. So to the men in the white hoodie and the creepy fire weirdos, let's never ever fucking meet. The sharp scent of chemicals stung my nose as I crouched behind a fallen tree. My heart thudded in my chest so loudly that I feared it would give away our hiding spot. What had started as a peaceful hike had quickly escalated into a desperate fight for survival. I never imagined that stumbling upon a hidden meth lab deep in the woods would put me and my friends in such grave danger. Yet here we were, being hunted like prey in a forest that had transformed into our cage. My name's Alex, and I've always been an outdoors enthusiast. So when my friends Jake and Sarah suggested a weekend hike in the Ozarks, I eagerly agreed. We were all seasoned hikers, confident in our ability to handle whatever challenges nature threw at us. But nature, it turned out, wasn't the real danger. We left early Friday morning, the cool, crisp air filled with the promise of adventure. The trail we picked was off the beaten path, recommended by a local guide as a tough but rewarding route. For the first day and a half, that's exactly what it was. We navigated steep hills, crossed babbling streams, and marveled at the thick canopy above. It wasn't until late Saturday afternoon that things began to change. We'd veered slightly off the main trail, following what appeared to be a game path, hoping to find a good spot to set up camp for the night. "Guys, do you smell that?" Sarah asked, wrinkling her nose. I took a deep breath, and the air hit me. There was a strange, sharp odor. It reminded me of the time I'd accidentally left a can of paint thinner open in my garage. "Maybe there's a factory nearby?" Jake suggested, though his voice was unsure. We should have turned back right then, but our curiosity got the better of us. We pressed forward, following the scent as it grew stronger. As we pushed through thick brush, the trees suddenly gave way to a small clearing. What we saw made us freeze in place. In the center of the clearing stood a rundown cabin, but it wasn't the cabin that held our attention. It was the collection of equipment scattered around it. Plastic containers, tubes, propane tanks, and other tools I'd only ever seen in crime shows. "Holy shit," Jake whispered. "Is that what I think it is?" Before either Sarah or I could respond, we heard voices, rough, angry voices, coming from inside the cabin. "Get down," I hissed, dropping to the ground behind a fallen log. Jake and Sarah quickly followed suit, pressing our bodies into the damp earth. Through a gap in the log, I could see 2 men emerge from the cabin. They were arguing about something. Supplies, I think. They looked nothing like the stereotypical meth cooks I'd seen on TV. These guys were burly, with hard eyes and clothes that had seen better days. And they were armed. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, slowly starting to back away. But as I moved, my backpack caught on a branch. The resulting snap seemed to echo through the clearing. The men's heads whipped in our direction. "What was that?" One of them growled. Probably just an animal, the other replied. But he didn't sound convinced. We lay there, barely breathing, praying they wouldn't investigate further. For a moment, it seemed like luck was on our side. The men turned back to their conversation. Then Jake sneezed. It wasn't loud, but in the tense silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. "There's someone out there," one of the men shouted. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We scrambled to our feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for stealth. Behind us, I could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. "Split up," I yelled to Jake and Sarah. "Meet back at the car if you can." It was a risky move, but I hoped it would confuse our pursuers. I veered left while Jake and Sarah went right. I ran like I'd never run before, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but fear kept me going. I could hear someone behind me gaining ground. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw one of the men, his face twisted with rage, not 20 yards behind me. In my moment of distraction, my foot caught on a root. I went down hard, tumbling down a small incline. Pain shot through my ankle as I tried to get up. "Got you now, you little bastard," the man snarled, emerging from the trees above me. In desperation, I grabbed a handful of dirt and leaves and threw it at his face. He cursed, momentarily blinded, and I used that moment to stumble to my feet and keep running. The pain in my ankle was excruciating, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I had no idea where I was going, no plan beyond getaway. As I ran, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were denser here, the undergrowth thicker. It was getting darker too, the sun setting behind the mountains. I don't know how long I ran. Could have been minutes or hours. Every sound made me flinch. Was it my pursuer, or just the natural noises of the forest? Finally, when I felt I couldn't take another step, I saw it. A small cave, half hidden by a curtain of vines. Without hesitation, I dove inside. The cave was shallow. More of an overhang really, but it was enough. I pressed myself against the back wall, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. Outside, I could hear movement, heavy footsteps, branches snapping. He was close. "I know you're around here somewhere," the man called out. His voice was closer than I expected, and I had to stifle a gasp. I closed my eyes, willing myself to become invisible. The footsteps drew nearer, then paused right outside my hiding spot. For a moment that felt like an eternity, there was silence. I didn't dare breathe. Then, mercifully, the footsteps started to move away. I waited until I could no longer hear any sound before allowing myself to relax slightly. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I had to find Jake and Sarah, had to get help. As quietly as I could, I eased myself out of the cave. The forest was dark now, the trees casting long shadows in the fading light. I had no idea which direction to go, but I knew I couldn't go back the way I'd come. I picked a direction and started walking, trying to favor my injured ankle. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every rustling leaf had me looking over my shoulder. After what felt like hours of aimless wandering, I heard something that made my heart leap, the sound of running water, a stream. And if I could find the stream, I might be able to find my way back to the trail. I followed the sound, hope giving me renewed energy. As I pushed through a dense patch of undergrowth, I suddenly found myself face to face with Sarah. We both stifled screams of surprise, then hugged each other fiercely. "Oh my God, Alex," Sarah whispered. "I thought I didn't know if I'm okay." I assured her, though okay was a relative term at this point. "Have you seen Jake?" She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "We got separated. I've been hiding, trying to figure out what to do." Together, we made the decision to follow the stream. It had to lead somewhere, and it was our best shot at finding a way out of this nightmare. We walked through the night, flinching at every sound, constantly on edge, expecting one of our pursuers to emerge from behind every tree. As the first light of dawn broke, we finally heard something that filled us with both relief and fear, the distant hum of vehicles. We approached cautiously, hearts pounding. Through the trees, we saw a road, and on that road, a welcome sight, police cars. It turned out that Jake had managed to find his way back to our car, and immediately driven to the nearest town to get help. The police had been searching for us all night. As they escorted us to safety, I glanced back at the forest. Somewhere in there were dangerous men and their illegal operation, but they wouldn't be free for much longer. The aftermath of our ordeal was a blur. Police reports, medical checks. The meth lab was raided, the men arrested. We were hailed as heroes by the local media. Though we didn't feel heroic at the time, it took a long while for the nightmares to stop, for me to hear a twig snap without instinctively flinching. Eventually, though, I found my way back to the trails. The forest, once a place of tranquility and adventure, had shown me its darker side, but it had also revealed my own strength, my will to survive. Now, when I hike, I carry with me the knowledge that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places, but I also carry the certainty that I can face whatever threat comes my way and overcome it. The forest may hide secrets, some of them deadly, but it can never conceal the human spirit's incredible capacity for survival. When I was younger, my friends and I were into urban exploring long before it became a trend. We lived in a rough area filled with old apartment buildings that had been abandoned and eventually torn down due to asbestos. The stuff was basically fireproof, but where fire and smoke kill quickly, asbestos works in a much slower, more insidious way. Trying to explain this to a bunch of teenagers looking for places to escape from the adults and do some grown-up things was impossible. While others saw the buildings as nothing more than decaying, dusty dumps, we saw them as our own personal hideouts, our little corner of freedom. I wouldn't say home, but it was a place we felt comfortable. One such estate had been mostly deserted, with most of its residents relocated by the city council, leaving only a few families behind. Felt like a ghost town. Even the local corner shop had its shutters permanently closed, with a for sale sign hanging there, marking the end of its run. But like I said, that was exactly the kind of place we loved. So when people moved out, we moved in. There was this one set of high-rise flats, apartment buildings for those of you in North America, that we visited regularly. The utilities had been turned off for some time, and this was in the middle of winter. So we started stashing cans of cider in old cupboards that acted like walk-in fridges. Eventually, we made ourselves comfortable, bringing an old nylon string guitar and other things to make the flat feel a bit more like a home. One night, just after Christmas, 5 of us piled into the flat to drink and sing. I remember we were in the middle of Man Who Sold the World by Bowie when the off-key twang of a string breaking made us all groan in disappointment. And of course, it was the G string. Anyone who knows anything about guitars will tell you, if you break the top or bottom string, it's not a big deal, but the G string completely messes with the sound. So, there we were, stuck with a silent disco for the rest of the night. But it didn't ruin our spirits entirely, and we decided to stay for a few hours to at least make the most of the evening. We were sitting around, chatting and bumming smokes off each other, when one of us suddenly hushed everyone, holding up a finger to indicate we should listen. There was a moment of complete silence, and I mean absolute silence. No one heard anything. So, the guy who had hushed us just shrugged it off as him imagining things. The mood lightened again, and we went back to drinking and hanging out. But not long after, the same guy repeated the same hush, and this time he wasn't alone. Another one of us swore he heard it too, a scratching or shuffling sound coming from the dark corridor outside the flat. If it had just been one guy getting paranoid, we would have ignored it, but when 2 of us heard the same thing, we started to take it more seriously. One of us pokes their head out of the flat, shining the light off of his phone screen into the darkness before turning back to tell us there was nothing there. These flats were half falling down. It was perfectly reasonable to expect them to creak and croak a fair bit, but the 2 guys who had heard the noises remained anxious, shooting each other nervous looks in between scanning the flat's open doorway for movement. Cut to a few hours later, and it's coming up to midnight. Energy levels are dipping severely, and so were the noise levels. This meant the atmospherics were perfectly attuned for us to perfectly hear the creaking of a floorboard just above our heads. This wasn't just the rundown condition of the building either. It was painfully obvious that the slow and deliberate creak came from a footfall on the floor above us. Don't ask me how we knew that. Sometimes your gut just tells you everything you need to know about a certain sound or a shape in the darkness. That's how the human race has survived for so long and so successfully. There really is such a thing as a sixth sense. As soon as we hear that creak, we all freeze. I mean, proper statue still, barely even breathing, with all eyes glued to the ceiling. We start asking each other what that was, but we all knew. Someone or something was up there, and it had been the entire time. I should add at this point, we had managed to compile a little collective of wooden sticks, iron bars, and other such debris that we told ourselves were our weapons stash. It was all just a bit of a joke, to be honest. They were purely totemic value. But in the moments that followed that horrible bloody creak, I thanked that what was holy, that we had had the foresight to collect them. Each of us grabbed something to defend ourselves with before falling silent again, listening out for any other creaking sounds above us. We weren't left waiting long. Another creak, then another, each one getting closer and closer to where the front entrance to the upstairs flat would be. We couldn't help but sit there, terrified, listening as whatever was up there got closer and closer to us. When the footsteps stopped, one of us plucked up the courage to creep towards the open front door to the flat and stick their head out. The next thing I know, we're just pouring down the stairs of the apartment block with the lad who scouted the stairs out shouting how there's someone up there. We were scared, maybe a little over paranoid. But over the next few days, we started to question if we'd even seen what we thought we had. I remember seeing the shape of something on the stairs above us, but I wasn't 100% sure it was a man, and neither was anyone else if we were honest with ourselves. In the end, I had convinced myself that we had imagined the whole thing and decided to run a little experiment. I left a loaf of bread in the lobby of the apartment block, intending to prove that there was no one living there when the loaf was still there, growing mold a few days later. But when I went back, it was gone. Years later, we watched the council demolish those flats as wrecking balls smashed into the brickwork and plastic window frames. We mourned our old hideaway, yes, but mostly we wondered if whoever was in there would be buried in the rubble. Anyone who has camped in the Adirondack region of upstate New York knows how stunning and serene it can be throughout the year. Last year, my family stayed in a cabin tucked away in the mountains. I had recently gone through a breakup with my longtime girlfriend, and the idea of getting away to clear my mind in such a peaceful setting seemed perfect. At first, it worked just as I'd hoped. Being surrounded by nature was soothing, and it was nice to spend time with my family. One of the great things about the cabin was how isolated it was. The nearest cabin or campsite was likely over a mile away, so we had complete privacy, or so we thought. One late afternoon, probably around 5 p.m., we started hearing some rustling noises from the front of the cabin. We were on the back porch when we first heard what sounded like footsteps. Feeling a little uneasy, my brother and I stood up, ready in case we needed to react. Out of nowhere, 2 middle-aged men walked around the back of the cabin toward us. I asked, rather sharply, "Hey, what are you doing? Can I help you with something?" The men just smiled and laughed. Then one of them said, "Why, hello there, young man. My name's Louis and this is Tito. We just wanted to check out the view here. We've heard so many great things about this place." Louis seemed genuine enough, but something didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling in my stomach as I looked at them. My mom, being friendly as always, started chatting with Louis. But the most unsettling part of the entire encounter was Tito, who just stood there, staring at the house without showing any expression. He didn't speak or move much, which made the situation feel even stranger. While Louis was charismatic, smiling often and making lots of eye contact, Tito was almost his opposite, stoic and detached. After a few minutes of small talk, they disappeared back into the woods. I wasn't comfortable with this at all, so I quickly told my family about what had happened. Where did these guys come from? I wondered. As I mentioned earlier, the closest place was at least a mile away, and it was owned by the man who rented out the cabin we were staying in. So Louis and Tito must have hiked a good distance to get to us, which isn't out of the question in the Adirondacks. But something about the whole encounter didn't sit right, and it left me uneasy the entire night. Around 11 p.m., my family went to bed, and I stayed up by the fire with my brother and his fiancée. Every little noise made me jump, and my brother reassured me that I was just overthinking it. He told me not to worry, that it was nothing. I pretended to feel okay, but deep down, I couldn't shake the unease about our unexpected visitors. Before long, it was just my brother and me by the fire. We decided to let the last few logs burn out before we went inside. This is when Louis decided to pay us another visit, but this time he was not so friendly. My brother and I jumped out of our chairs and were now facing Louis and Tito, who were coming out of the woods. They looked crazy. Louis did not have that same charming personality as before. His eyes were bulging from his head, and he flashed his pearly white teeth in an almost sadistic way. Tito, who was almost a statue earlier in the day, stood next to Louis, also smiling and slowly approaching me and my brother. Louis started to slowly approach us and said, "This cabin really is lovely. I think we will be staying here now." He reached into his bag as if to pull something out. Tito, who was slightly behind him, was already wielding some sort of bushwhacking sword, not trying to take any chances as to what Louis was pulling out of the bag. My brother decided to tackle him. He went down with relative ease. As Tito approached my brother with the sword, I ran over and pushed him, strictly only using adrenaline as my motivator. Both men got up and backed away. Louis, now standing about 10 feet away, kept saying, "You have no idea who I am and who you are messing with. I built this house. This is my land." After repeating this a couple of times, Tito finally spoke up as well and said in an almost robotic voice, "We shall have our land back. We must wait for the right time." Tito grabbed the shoulder of Louis and they both ran into the woods. Remember, this is after midnight in the woods, so it was pitch black other than a soft orange light from the dying fire. We put the fire out rather quickly and went inside the cabin and made sure all the doors and windows were locked. My brother and I stayed up all night and basically watched the property to make sure they did not return. I have never been so happy to see the sun in my entire life. The next day, we went to see the property owner and told him about the entire night. He said he had never heard the two names before and assured me that no Louis ever built the house. The owner who we were renting the cabin from told us that he had built the cabin 10 years ago. So who were these two that claimed they had built the cabin? The owner was kind enough to refund us the rest of the nights we were supposed to stay at the cabin. I know this could have ended much worse for us, but all things considered, I am very lucky that I left with no more than some minor psychological damage. Be safe, everybody, and always lock your doors. You never know who could be creeping around. I've been a police officer in my county for almost a decade. I've seen some pretty crazy and disturbing things. Things that sometimes make me question why I ever chose this career. But what happened on this particular night still sticks with me the most. It's the one event that I find myself thinking about the most, even now. It was nearing the end of winter, but where I work, it stays cold well into spring. That night, I was on patrol of the major highway for most of my shift. On most nights, I would stop maybe 2 or 3 cars for speeding, and other than that, the shifts were pretty uneventful. Occasionally, a call for backup would come in, but typically, patrol shifts are boring and quiet. I was driving along my usual route around 2 a.m. when I passed a car on the side of the road that hadn't been there before. Its lights were off, and it was way off on the shoulder, so I hadn't noticed it until I was already past it. I took the next exit, made a full loop, and returned about 15 minutes later to where I'd seen it. I assumed it was just an abandoned vehicle, maybe broken down, so I wasn't in a rush. I pulled in behind it, parked about 15 feet away, and left my headlights on. I radioed in that I was investigating what appeared to be an empty vehicle on the southbound highway. I got out of my car with my flashlight and walked over to the vehicle. My first thought was that the car looked old. It seemed to be from the 90s, rusty with dents and scratches all over it. I walked up to the driver's side window and shined my flashlight inside. Nobody was there, but as I looked around, I noticed some disturbing things. There was a pile of clothes in the back seat which seemed to belong to a young woman, but the way they were scattered didn't look right at all. I moved around to the other side of the car, but then I heard a faint noise behind me. I spun around and pointed my flashlight out into the woods next to the highway. The noise stopped immediately, but I had heard enough to know it was footsteps. Someone was out there, possibly watching me. I yelled out, instructing them to step into the light with their hands raised. A moment passed, and then I yelled again, but there was no response. My heart was pounding as I updated the situation on the radio and called for backup. I stood there, staring into the woods, honestly feeling like my life was on the line. If something had gone wrong here, whoever was out there might be trying to keep me from finding out the truth. I drew my firearm and carefully moved behind the car, keeping a close watch on the tree line while staying as hidden as possible. The next 5 minutes felt like an eternity. But finally, another officer arrived on the scene, and right away, I heard footsteps running further into the woods. We quickly began searching the vehicle, and it was clear something was off. But searching the woods at night, with someone possibly dangerous nearby, wasn't a safe option. We found signs of violence in the car, as well as an empty ammo package. It was likely that whoever was out there had a firearm with them. The feeling of knowing someone had been watching me, possibly with a weapon aimed at me, was one of the most terrifying feelings I've had to deal with. The next day, we were able to get more information and run a more thorough investigation. However, the car turned out to be untraceable. We found some shoe prints in the woods, but they faded out quickly, offering no direction. What really happened that night remains an open case, with no leads on suspects or victims, and it's something that I can't stop thinking about. I was camping with family over a long 3-day weekend. A few of us didn't have to head back to work right away, so we decided to extend the trip by another night. The campground, which had been bustling earlier, was now empty except for us. My brother, his young son, me, and my young daughter. Around 3 a.m., my daughter woke me up, telling me she needed to go to the bathroom. She needed to poop, so there was no way she was going to squat outside the tent. The outhouse was about 100 yards away through the darkened campground. The fire had burned out, and there wasn't much moonlight. I got her up, grabbed a flashlight, and we made our way to the outhouse. She took care of business, and I stood outside, trying to ignore how uneasy I felt being out there in the dark, miles away from anywhere, with my 7-year-old daughter alone in that dark outhouse. Luckily, she was quick. We stumbled back toward camp in the pitch-black night, the flashlight our only guide. The walk back was uneventful, though we didn't say much. I tried to comfort her as best I could, reminding her that we were safe out there despite how isolated we were in the empty campground. When we were about 50 feet from the campsite, my daughter suddenly grabbed my hand and whispered, "Eddie, who is that?" Confused, I asked, "Who's what, honey?" "That man right there. Who is that?" she replied. I shined the light where she was pointing, but I didn't see anyone. I tightened my grip on her hand and quickened our pace, eager to get back to the tent, the only place where we felt safe. In the pitch-black night, if someone was out there with bad intentions, we could be in real trouble. We finally made it back to the tent and zipped ourselves inside. I lay there, straining to hear anything from outside. There were countless sounds I'd never noticed before, each one adding to my mounting anxiety about whoever might be lurking nearby. As she drifted toward sleep, she asked if we were all right. I reassured her with a yes, though I was completely freaking out inside. I asked her what the man had looked like, and she said he looked like a Native American. I lay awake for what seemed like hours, unable to shake the fear. Finally, I woke up my brother and told him what had happened. He's much more comfortable in the woods than I am, so he got up, started the fire again, and we sat by it until daylight. Nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I asked my daughter about the man she'd seen, and she didn't remember it at all. To this day, she has no recollection of the event. The area we were camping in is well known for its historical significance to Native American tribes who lived and thrived there before being forced onto reservations or killed. Neither my brother nor I found any sign of anyone being in the woods. If someone had been walking around, we would have heard them. My only explanation is that my daughter had been so exhausted she may have had a microsleep or some sort of dream. But honestly, It still creeps me out to this day. The first time I saw the girl with the haunted eyes, I knew something was terribly wrong. But I never imagined that my night shift at a remote truck stop would lead me straight into the dark underbelly of human trafficking. As I stood behind the counter, watching the steady stream of truckers and late-night travelers, I had no clue that I was about to uncover a sinister operation that would change my life forever. My name's Jack, and I've been working the graveyard shift at Big Rig's truck stop for about 6 months now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills and gives me plenty of quiet time to work on my novel. Or at least that's what I thought it would do. The night everything changed started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., nodding to Dave, the day shift guy, as he headed out. The first few hours were uneventful. A steady flow of truckers coming in for coffee, snacks, and a break to stretch their legs. It was around 2 a.m. when I first saw her. A young girl, maybe 16 or 17, walked in with a much older man. Something about the way she moved, the way she kept her eyes down, sent alarm bells ringing in my head. The man marched her straight to the restrooms at the back of the store. "Wait here," I heard him growl before coming up to the counter. "Pack of smokes," he grunted, not meeting my eyes. As I reached to grab the cigarettes, I caught a glimpse of the girl in the security mirror. She was standing exactly where the man had left her, but her eyes were darting around frantically, like a cornered animal desperately looking for a way out. I handed the man his cigarettes, trying to keep my voice casual as I asked, "Everything okay with your daughter?" His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Mind your own business," he snarled, snatching the pack from my hand and stalking back to the girl. I watched as he roughly grabbed her arm and dragged her out of the store. My stomach churned. Something was very, very wrong. Over the next few weeks, I saw more girls like her. Always young, always with older men who treated them more like property than people. I started paying closer attention, noticing the patterns. The same trucks would show up at odd hours. Men would exchange hushed words and knowing glances. I knew I had to do something, but I was scared. What if I was wrong? What if I was just imagining things? And even if I was right, what could I, a simple night clerk, do against what was clearly a large, organized operation? It was a quiet Tuesday night when things came to a head. A big rig pulled in around 3 a.m., and I recognized the driver as one of the regulars I'd been watching. He came in alone, but when he left, he had 2 young girls with him. They looked drugged, barely able to walk straight. My heart pounded as I watched them climb into the truck. This was it. I couldn't just stand by anymore. With shaking hands, I picked up the phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I took a deep breath. I think I've uncovered a human trafficking ring operating out of Big Rig's truck stop on Highway 20. The dispatcher's voice sharpened. Can you elaborate, sir? I told her everything I'd seen over the past few weeks, describing the girls, the men, the patterns I'd noticed. As I spoke, I kept my eyes on the security cameras, watching the parking lot. Units are on their way, the dispatcher assured me. Is there anything else you can tell us? Just then, I saw movement on one of the screens. A van had pulled up, and men were ushering more girls into it. They're moving them now, I said urgently. There's a van. Suddenly, the bell over the door jangled. I looked up to see one of the men I'd been watching walk in. Our eyes met, and I knew he'd heard me. I have to go, I whispered into the phone, hanging up quickly. The man's eyes narrowed as he approached the counter. Who were you talking to? He demanded. Just my girlfriend. I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. She worries if I don't check in. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes. Come out from behind the counter, he said, his hand moving to his waistband where I caught a glimpse of a gun. My mind raced. Couldn't let him take me outside. I'd seen enough crime shows to know I'd never come back if I did. Look, I said, raising my hands. I don't want any trouble. I don't know anything, and I haven't seen anything. Okay. He smirked. Cold, humorless expression. Oh, I think you've seen plenty. Now move or I'll. He never finished the sentence. At that moment, The parking lot lit up with red and blue flashing lights. The man's head whipped around his face, contorting with rage. "You little rat," he snarled, reaching for his gun. I didn't think. I just reacted. I grabbed the pot of hot coffee from behind me and hurled it at him. He screamed as the scalding liquid hit his face when stumbling backwards. I vaulted over the counter and ran for the door. Outside, it was chaos. Police cars had swarmed the parking lot. Officers were shouting orders, their guns drawn. The van I'd seen earlier was trying to back out, but a police cruiser blocked its path. I burst out of the store, my hands raised. "I'm the one who called," I shouted, as several officers turned their weapons towards me. One of them rushed over quickly, ushering me behind a police car. "Stay down," he ordered, before running back towards the store. From my position, I could see everything. The men were being arrested, pulled from their trucks in the van. And the girls, God, there were so many of them. Some looked dazed. Others were crying. A few tried to run, only to be gently but firmly stopped by female officers. It was over in minutes, but it felt like hours. When the dust settled, one of the detectives came to take my statement. As I talked, I watched paramedics treating the girls, wrapping them in blankets and leading them to waiting ambulances. "You did good, son," the detective said when I'd finished. "Real good. We've been trying to crack this ring for months. Your information was the break we needed." I nodded, feeling numb. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me shaky and exhausted. "What's going to happen to the girls?" I asked. The detective's face softened. "They'll get help, counseling, medical treatment, whatever they need. It's going to be a long road, but they've got a chance now, thanks to you." In the days that followed, the full scope of the operation came to light. It wasn't just big rigs. The ring had been operating out of truck stops across 3 states. Dozens of girls were rescued, some of whom had been missing for years. I gave more statements, testified in court. The truck stop's owner was arrested too. He'd been turning a blind eye in exchange for a cut of the profits. I was offered a reward, but I couldn't take it. Instead, I asked for it to be donated to organizations that help trafficking survivors. I don't work at big rigs anymore. Couldn't stand to be there after everything that happened. But I didn't give up on my dream of being a writer. In fact, I found my story. I'm writing about what happened, about the girls, about the dark world that exists right under our noses. Sometimes I think about that first girl, the one with the haunted eyes. I never found out what happened to her specifically, but I like to think she's out there somewhere, free, maybe even happy. And on the nights when the memories keep me awake, when I see those girls' faces in my dreams, I hold on to that thought, because that's the thing about evil. It thrives in the shadows, in silence and complacency. But it only takes one person to shine a light, to speak up. One person can make a difference. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who was in the right place at the right time and chose not to look away. And if my story teaches people anything, I hope it's this: pay attention. Look out for each other. And if you see something wrong, say something. You never know whose life you might save. The first thing I noticed about him was the blood. It was caked under his fingernails, smeared across his torn shirt, and matted in his wild, unkempt hair. He stumbled into our campsite just as the sun was setting, his eyes wide and unfocused, muttering incoherently about being lost. In that moment, as my family froze in shock and fear, I had no idea that this stranger's arrival would turn our peaceful camping trip into a night of terror and survival. We had been looking forward to this trip for months. My wife, Lisa, our 2 kids, Tommy, 12, and Sarah, 9, and I had planned a week-long adventure in the Cascade Mountains. It was our chance to disconnect from the world, bond as a family, and enjoy the great outdoors. The first 3 days had been idyllic. Hiking, fishing, and sitting around the campfire telling stories and roasting marshmallows. But on that 4th evening, everything changed. I was tending the fire while Lisa prepared dinner. Tommy and Sarah were playing a card game nearby when we heard rustling in the underbrush. At first, I thought it might be a deer or maybe even a bear, and I reached for the bear spray we kept handy. But then he appeared, this stranger who looked like he'd been through hell. "Help!" he croaked, stumbling toward us. "Please, I'm lost." Lisa gasped, pulling the kids close to her. I stood up slowly, my hands still on the bear spray. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "are you all right? Are you hurt?" He shook his head frantically, his matted hair whipping around his face. "Lost for days. Can't find my way back." As he got closer, I could see that what I had initially thought was dirt on his clothes was actually dried blood. My heart raced, but I tried to maintain a calm exterior for my family's sake. "Okay," I said, holding up my hands in what I hoped was a reassuring gesture. "Just take it easy. We can help you. Why don't you sit down by the fire and we'll get you some water?" He nodded gratefully and collapsed onto one of our camp chairs. Lisa, her face pale with worry, handed me a bottle of water, which I passed to the stranger. He gulped it down greedily, water and saliva dribbling down his chin. "What's your name?" I asked once he had finished drinking. "John," he rasped.
Jon Kolel.
"All right, John. Can you tell us what happened? How did you get lost?" John's eyes darted around nervously, never quite focusing on any of us. "Hiking. With friends. Got separated. Been wandering for days." Something about his story didn't quite add up. If he'd been lost for days, why hadn't we heard any search helicopters or seen any rescue teams? And the blood, where had it come from if he wasn't injured? I glanced at Lisa, and I could see the same doubts reflected in her eyes. She nodded slightly, understanding my unspoken message to keep the kids close. "John," I said carefully, "we have a satellite phone. We can call for help. Get a rescue team out here." At the mention of calling for help, John's demeanor changed instantly. His eyes, previously unfocused, suddenly sharpened with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "No," he shouted, leaping to his feet with surprising agility. "No calls. They'll find me." Tommy and Sarah whimpered, pressing closer to Lisa. I stepped between them and John, my hand tightening on the bear spray. "Who'll find you, John?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Who are you running from?" John's eyes darted around wildly, as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows at any moment. "The others," he whispered, "the ones who changed, they're hunting me." A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. This man wasn't just lost. He was delusional, possibly dangerous. We were miles from the nearest town, with no way to call for help without agitating him further. "Okay, John," I said soothingly. "No calls. Why don't you just sit back down and we'll figure this out?" For a moment, he seemed to calm down, sinking back into the chair. But then Sarah, in a small and frightened voice, confessed, "Daddy, why does the man have blood on him?" John's head snapped towards her, his eyes wild. "Blood," he muttered. "Yes, blood. Had to defend myself. They tried to take me, but I fought back. I won." He stood up again, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I could see Lisa from the corner of my eye, slowly edging the kids towards the tent. "John," I said, trying to draw his attention back to me, "why don't you tell me more about these others? Who are they?" But John wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on Sarah, a strange hungry look on his face. "So young," he murmured, "so pure. They haven't gotten to her yet." That was all I needed to hear. In one fluid motion, I raised the bear spray and unleashed a cloud of burning mist directly into John's face. He screamed, a sound more animal than human, clawing at his eyes. I turned to my family, shouting, "Run. Get to the car." Lisa didn't hesitate. She scooped up Sarah and grabbed Tommy's hand, sprinting towards our SUV parked a short distance away. I stayed behind, keeping myself between them and the howling, thrashing John. But even blinded and in pain, John was unnaturally strong. He lunged forward, catching me off guard and tackling me to the ground. We grappled in the dirt, his hands clawing at my face, trying to gouge my eyes. I could smell his rancid breath, see the madness in his bloodshot eyes. "You can't stop it," he screamed, The change is coming for all of us. With a surge of desperate strength, I managed to knee him in the stomach and push him off. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I reached the car just as Lisa was starting the engine. I dove into the passenger seat, yelling, "Go, go, go." Lisa floored it, the SUV fishtailing on the uneven forest road. In the rearview mirror, I could see John chasing after us, moving with an inhuman speed that sent fresh waves of terror through me. We sped through the darkening forest, the trees a blur on either side. The kids were crying in the back seat, and I could hear the panic in Lisa's breathing as she navigated the treacherous road. "What was wrong with that man, Dad?" Tommy asked between sobs. "I don't know, buddy," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "But we're safe now. We're going to be okay." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The image of John's wild eyes and blood-stained hands was seared into my mind, and his words echoed in my ears. The change is coming for all of us. We drove through the night, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. We went straight to the police station, where we spent hours giving statements and descriptions. They sent out search parties, but they never found John Carlisle. They did, however, find our campsite destroyed, with strange symbols drawn in blood on the trees surrounding it. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to put the incident behind us. We told ourselves it was just a chance encounter with a disturbed individual, nothing more. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering about John and the others he spoke of. I think about the fear in his eyes, the conviction in his voice when he talked about the change. And I can't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see a wild-eyed figure emerging from the shadows, coming to finish what he started in those woods. We don't go camping anymore. The kids say they're too old for it now. But I know the real reason. The wilderness, once a place of peace and adventure for our family, has become tainted with the memory of that night. And sometimes, when the wind howls and the shadows grow long, I find myself wondering if John was right. Is there something out there? Something changing, something hunting? And if there is, how long before it finds us again? I know many of us believe in ghosts, but the real question is, have you ever seen one? For years, I watched ghost shows like Ghost Adventures, but I never thought I'd actually experience anything myself. I'd always just brushed off bumps in the night, but these two stories still send shivers down my spine. Back in 2013, I had just turned 19 and was living in a very small town in Alberta, Canada. That year, the rivers surrounding the town flooded. Many homes were lost, along with lives in the surrounding communities. I think this tragedy is what made the energy in the area stronger. At the time, I was living with my boyfriend's family in a very old house, about 112 years old, to be exact. It was a small, typical farmhouse that had been moved into town from an unknown farm in Alberta. The house had 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a new basement addition with 2 more bedrooms. Imagine an old farmhouse with original hardwood floors, white crown moldings, narrow hallways, and small rooms. My boyfriend and I stayed in the new basement addition, which was always freezing and pitch dark. Before I moved in, his mom had seen a dark figure standing outside the house, staring in through the windows at night. This thing would bang on the doors and the exterior walls. When anyone new moved in, that figure would come inside too. Not long after we moved in, new neighbors came next door, and that's when things started getting even stranger. Every day when everyone came home from work, things would be moved around, like it had been rummaged through, but nothing was ever taken. We started to suspect the neighbors might be sneaking into the house. One day, me and my boyfriend got home before anyone else and like normal things were moved around. So we cleansed everything else and went downstairs to relax before bed. His family had 3 dogs at the time and you could hear them walking around upstairs. We finally get ready for bed and lay down. All of a sudden, we hear someone run around upstairs. Not the dogs walking around, but a person stomping. But none of the dogs were barking or getting upset. No one else was going to be home till about 11 p.m. or later. We call his mom asking if she had gotten home, and the answer was no. So my boyfriend jumps out of bed and grabs a shotgun thinking someone had broken into the house. He sweeps the house room to room and nothing. No one but the dogs and us were there. As soon as we get back, we lay down after finding out no one was there. Whatever had walked through the house before runs out. One day, I was staying at my boyfriend's sister's house for the night. This home she owns is very haunted. Her daughters talk to a person named Oji, screaming and yelling. This thing is scarring them. Their motion-censored toys go off all the time and so on. Anyways, this night I was just falling asleep on the couch, and out of the corner of my eye something keeps moving in the kitchen next to the living room. All of the sudden, in the middle of the night, I wake up to a chill running down my spine. I go to the kitchen to grab a glass of water. As I walk into the kitchen, the overhead light flicks on and I turn to tell the kids it's late and time for bed. But instead I see a woman in a white dress. Her body was deformed. Her long dark hair was covering her face. Think the girl from The Grudge hair. Then as soon as the light flicked on, it goes off and she's gone. This house is built next to an old unmarked graveyard. All the family has seen this woman walking through the house in the yard. I think it's evil as the kids are so scared of it and says she does mean things to them and lives on the ceiling. Needless to say, those homes scare me and everyone who lives in them. Now are ghosts real? Well, now I know they are. Let me start by saying that I've always believed in the paranormal, having witnessed apparitions in my childhood home. When I was 2, my family got a cat who quickly became my companion. He was a curious and energetic cat, and I had the energy to keep up with him. At night, he would often wander the house, making sure everything was in order with the family. If I was sick, he would stay with me, only leaving briefly to take care of his business before returning to my side. In fact, there was one occasion where he might have very well saved my life. I had a stomach bug, and while he was asleep, I apparently vomited while lying on my back and began choking. He went to my parents' room and pestered my mom until she woke up. Since I was only about 3 years old, my bedroom was right next to my parents', and she heard something was wrong. She came in, figured out what had happened, and took care of me, and everything turned out fine. Now, as I was so young, that's what I've been told and can't fully testify to the validity of it. But I feel it might be true because he was always such a nurturing cat. As I grew older, he would sometimes be lying on my bed with me or on the back of the couch behind my head. On a few occasions, he would suddenly arch his back in that distinctive way cats do when they sense something threatening. Every time this happened, there was nothing around that I could see, but at the time I didn't think much of it. Sadly, he passed away when I was 16, and I was heartbroken. He had been with me for as long as I could remember. We buried him in a peaceful spot between 2 trees in my grandmother's backyard, and I thought that was the end of it. However, over the course of the next few years, my mom, my stepdad, and I would often hear the familiar sound of a cat yowling hello in the same way he did when he was alive. If you've never heard a cat make this noise, it's easy to find examples online. Then, in late 2015, early 2016, when I was 18, I moved into a duplex with a friend. Up until that point, I hadn't experienced anything paranormal, including any sounds of my cat. That is, until one night when I was lying in bed, struggling to fall asleep as I often did. Suddenly, I felt a presence in the room with me. I opened my eyes, and since I was lying on my back, I had a clear view of the room. One of my neighbors across the street had a security light that stayed on all night, and its glow would hit my window, offering just enough illumination for me to see. To the right of my bed, in front of the window, stood a tall, shadowy figure of a man. Immediately, an intense wave of dread washed over me. Now, before continuing, I want to discount ideas of sleep paralysis. I know this wasn't sleep paralysis because I moved just moments before opening my eyes. As I said, I was struggling to get to sleep. Another thing is that I didn't feel the weight that is accompanied by being paralyzed. I was simply paralyzed by fear. I truly thought this thing was there to kill me. As the figure began to slowly move closer to my bed, it lifted up one arm as if it was going to touch me. Then suddenly it stopped in the sense of dread washed away from me, replaced with a feeling of comfort. I watched as its gaze shifted from my face towards my chest, then followed with my eyes. There, standing just over my chest, was a large figure of a cat with its back arched. Instantly, I knew it was my cat. It simply felt like him. Looking back toward the shadow man, there was a wave of negative energy. Then he simply disappeared. The last thing I remember from that night was seeing the figure of my cat laying down beside me, as he had so many times during my childhood before I finally was able to fall asleep. I think about that night every so often, and it always makes me happy knowing that he is still out there watching out for his family. Falling down, falling down, falling down. The incessant sound of my toddler echoed from the back seat as we made our way to the park. Cassie, keep it down back there. I can hardly hear myself think. My daughter, Cassandra, had really started to find her voice lately and was no stranger to repeating random things loudly and as often as possible. If you're familiar with the terrible twos and the years that follow, you can probably relate to that constant struggle. Finding moments of peace was tough at times, but my wife and I always did our best to make it work. Date nights were few and far between, but when we finally had one, it was always just what we needed. It had been a while since our last one, and I was thinking it was time to call up Cassie's grandpa for another. It was my wife's night out with her friends, and I had babysitting duty. Nothing beats a trip to the park to burn off all that energy. Cassie could run wild for 30 minutes to an hour, and by the time we were driving home, she'd be worn out. That would lead to her falling asleep in her car seat, and I could easily transfer her to bed once we arrived. As you can tell, I had it all figured out. But Cassie had some very specific preferences about which park she liked. It was a little strange, but there it was. Her favorite park was the one downtown with the stone chairs that let you talk to each other from a long distance. Something about their concave shape and how they were positioned to bounce the sound around made it work. There was plenty else to do there, but that park was always her favorite. As we reached the bridge heading into town, Cassie started to really wig out. She kept calling out, "Dad, Daddy, help." I was afraid that something was terribly wrong with her, so I pulled over just after the bridge into a nearby parking lot in front of a pizzeria. I unbuckled her as quickly as I could and pulled her to the front seat with me to examine her. "What's wrong? Sweetie, tell Daddy what's wrong." Everything appeared to be fine with her besides the fact that she wouldn't stop crying. I just held on to her and let her cry it out. Kids can get like that sometimes, but I was just glad to find out that she wasn't hurt. "It's gonna be all right, Cassie. We're gonna go to the park, and we can even stop to get some ice cream on the way if you want." I wasn't against a little bribing if it meant I could have some peace and quiet. Not the best parenting technique, but sometimes it was necessary for your sanity. That's when I heard it. A sound that would change my life as well as the lives of so many others. A loud rumbling accompanied by the sounds of piercing screams. I turned toward the noise and saw the bridge crumbling, covered from front to back in rush hour traffic. There were a couple of people who had been walking that scrambled in a mad dash, but were not able to make it to safety. Some of the drivers had thrown their doors open in hopes of the same, but it all happened far too fast. Not one person from one end to the other was able to make it off the bridge before the total collapse. It was a day that nobody in the city would ever forget, and in all that kept running through my head were the words of my daughter as she sat in the car seat on her way to cross the bridge. Falling down, falling down, falling down. Cassie was no stranger to occurrences such as this one. When she was too young to speak a word, she was already prone to these types of incidents. Well, at first glance, they might only seem a bit weird. Looking back now, I fear that they were premonitions which we were unable to understand. Her grandmother and my mother passed away due to a heart attack. The doctors said that if she had gotten to a hospital, it was more likely than not that she would have been able to pull through. The one thing that always stuck out to me about that day as far as Cassie was concerned, she had taken every block, every puzzle piece, and every toy that was shaped like a heart and placed it in the center of the room. If that wasn't strange enough, she had placed every one of them on top of her favorite pictures of her and her Nana from one of their many zoo trips that they had taken together. Much like this time with the bridge, Cassie had been completely inconsolable, although neither me nor my wife had the slightest clue what was wrong at the time. Another time that stands out was when we had brought Cassie to see the newest princess movie at the movie theaters. She had known very few words at this point, but she could manage to speak a select few from time to time. We had to leave early from the movie. Babies didn't tend to do well for long periods of time without crying or being noisy in some type of fashion. When we walked past the last theater on our way out, though, Cassie began to say, "Fire. Fire, Daddy. Mommy, fire." It was winter, and we'd been making fires at home every night. We promised Cassie that once we got home, we'd light a fire for her in the fireplace. Once we arrived, I tossed a few logs in and worked my magic with the kindling, newspaper, and some heavy blowing before grabbing the remote to turn on the nightly news. To our surprise, the theater we had just been at was on the screen, with flames crackling as a black cloud of smoke rose from the side of the building. Apparently, the theater we had been walking by when Cassie started talking about the fire had caught fire during the show, just moments after we had left. I could tell you about countless other instances like this, where things just felt too strange to be coincidence, but right now I don't have the stomach to go on about them. What I can't stop thinking about is what happened today. For the past hour, I've been pacing the bedroom, my stomach in knots, trying to figure out what this could all mean or what I should do. Yesterday, I witnessed the tragic events with the bridge, and as heartbreaking as that was, it's something my sweet daughter, Cassandra, said to me today that has me in such a frenzy. She looked at me and said, "Please watch out for the scary man, Daddy. I don't think I'll get any sleep tonight. God help me, I don't think I'll ever be able to sleep again." The gentle hum of bicycle wheels can lull you into a false sense of security. But on the winding roads of rural France, I learned that the most picturesque paths can sometimes lead straight into a nightmare. I had always dreamed of cycling through the French countryside. The idea of gliding past endless vineyards, charming villages, and sunflower fields had been a dream of mine for years. So when I finally saved enough for the trip, I didn't hesitate. I packed my gear, flew to Paris, and set off on what I thought would be the adventure of a lifetime. The first few days were everything I had hoped for and more. The weather was perfect, warm sun and a cool breeze that made cycling a pure joy. I stayed in cozy bed and breakfasts, savoring local meals and wine each evening. The people I met were friendly, always greeting me with a smile and a bonjour as I passed by. It was on the fourth day that everything changed. I had planned a long ride, aiming to reach a village famous for its medieval architecture. The route took me farther from the more touristy spots, into an untouched region of France that felt like a step back in time. As I pedaled along a narrow country road, enjoying the solitude and beauty of the landscape, I noticed a van behind me in the rearview mirror. It was far off, but something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way it seemed to be moving at the same pace, never getting closer, but never falling behind. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, this was probably the only road for miles. It made sense that we would be traveling in the same direction. But as the hours passed and the van stayed right behind me, my anxiety grew. I decided to take a detour, turning onto a smaller road that snaked through a thick forest. To my growing alarm, the van followed. My heart began to race. This couldn't be a coincidence. I sped up, pushing myself harder, hoping to shake them off on the winding path. But the van kept pace, its engine sound growing louder as it closed the gap. Panic set in. I was alone in a foreign country, on an isolated road, being followed by someone I couldn't identify. My mind raced through terrifying possibilities. Were they thieves, kidnappers, or something even worse? I spotted an opening between the trees and made a split-second decision. I swerved off the road, plunging into the forest. Branches lashed at my face as I fought to maintain control of my bike on the uneven terrain. Behind me, I heard the screech of brakes and car doors slamming. She went into the woods. A man's voice shouted in accented English, "Spread out and find her." Terror gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I pedaled furiously, ignoring the burning in my legs and lungs. The forest was dense, the ground treacherous. More than once, I nearly lost control, the bike skidding on loose leaves and exposed roots. I could hear them crashing through the undergrowth behind me, their shouts growing closer. I didn't dare look back, focusing all my energy on moving forward, on escaping. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the forest onto another road. Without hesitation, I turned and started pedaling again, my legs screaming in protest. I had no idea where I was or where this road led, but anywhere was better than back there. As I rode, I tried to make sense of what was happening. Who were these people? What did they want with me? I ran through everything I'd done in the past few days, trying to think if I'd somehow offended someone or witnessed something I shouldn't have. But nothing came to mind. The road began to climb, a steep hill that had me gasping for breath. But fear kept me going. At the top, I allowed myself a quick glance back. My heart sank as I saw the van in the distance, steadily gaining on me. I flew down the other side of the hill, taking the curves at dangerous speeds. The wind whipped past me, bringing tears to my eyes. I was going faster than I ever had on a bike, but it still didn't feel fast enough. As I rounded a bend, I saw something that made my heart leap, a small town in the distance. Civilization, safety. I pushed harder, willing my exhausted body to keep going just a little longer. I barreled into the town square, nearly colliding with a group of startled tourists. Ignoring their shouts of surprise, I spotted a police station and made straight for it. I practically fell off my bike at the station steps, stumbling inside with legs that felt like jelly. The officer at the desk looked up in alarm as I burst in, wild-eyed and gasping for breath. Help! I managed to choke out between gulps of air. Someone chasing me. The next few hours passed in a blur. I gave my statement to the police, describing the van and the men as best I could. They sent out patrols to search the area, but found no sign of my pursuers. As the adrenaline wore off, the full impact of what had happened hit me. I broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. The female officer who had taken my statement wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and pressed a cup of sweet tea into my hands. "You're safe now," she said gently in heavily accented English. "We will find these men." But they didn't. Despite an extensive search and investigation, no trace of the van or the men was ever found. The police had theories. Maybe they were part of a human trafficking ring, or thieves targeting tourists, but without more evidence, it was impossible to know for sure. My idyllic cycling trip had turned into a nightmare. I couldn't bring myself to get back on the bike. The very thought of those quiet country roads, once so appealing, now filled me with dread. I cut my trip short, flying home a week early. Back home, I struggled to readjust. The incident had shaken me to my core. I jumped at every sudden noise, flinched whenever a van drove by. Sleep was elusive, plagued by nightmares of endless chases through dark forests. Took time and therapy, but slowly I began to heal. I learned coping mechanisms for my anxiety and worked on rebuilding my sense of safety. But the experience had changed me in fundamental ways. I couldn't look at a bicycle the same way anymore. The freedom and joy it once represented were tainted by memories of fear and helplessness. It was months before I could bring myself to ride again, and even then, only in busy areas where I felt safe. As time passed, I started to share my story. At first, it was just with close friends and family. But eventually, I found the courage to speak at travel safety workshops. I wanted to warn others about the potential dangers, to encourage them to be cautious without letting fear stop them from exploring the world. It wasn't easy to relive that day, to see the shock and horror on people's faces as I recounted my experience. But it was also cathartic. Each time I told the story, it lost a little bit of its power over me. A year after the incident, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going back to France. Not to cycle this time, but to confront my fears head-on. I returned to the same region, driving those same roads that had once been the backdrop to my terror. It was harder than I expected. Every van I saw made my heart race. Every quiet stretch of road reminded me of that frantic flight through the forest. But with each passing mile, Each village I entered without incident, I felt a little stronger. On my final day, I found myself in the town where I had found refuge. Standing in the square, I gazed at the police station that had been my sanctuary, and for the first time since that day, I felt a deep sense of peace. I realized then that while the incident had changed me, it hadn't broken me. I was still here, still traveling, still living. The men in the van had stolen my sense of security, but they hadn't taken my spirit. As I boarded the flight home from that second trip, I felt a shift within me. The fear was still there, quietly lingering at the back of my mind, but it no longer held control over me. I had faced it, acknowledged it, and moved forward in spite of it. I may never cycle alone through the French countryside again, but I won't let that one terrifying experience define me or limit my life. Instead, I choose to focus on the beauty I saw, the kindness of the people who helped me, and the strength I discovered within myself. Because in the end, that's what travel is truly about. Not just seeing new places, but finding new parts of ourselves. Sometimes those discoveries come from moments of joy and wonder. And sometimes, as I learned on those winding French roads, they come from confronting our deepest fears and emerging stronger on the other side. I used to work in a building with 2 security guards, a harmless older guy and a younger guy around my age who was definitely not so harmless. Over time, he became friendly with me and eventually asked me out. I agreed, even though I had already mentioned that I was moving out of the country soon, so I made it clear that nothing would come of it. But, hey, if he wanted to buy me dinner, I figured why not? Big mistake, though, was giving him my address to pick me up. I mean, he's the security guard at work, and with me leaving the country, it felt like a small risk. I told some of my office mates about the dinner plans. What's the worst that could happen? Well, he showed up on time with 24 roses, and then he tells me he bought a brand new suit and had his car detailed just for the occasion. It felt a bit much, but he seemed nice enough, so I thanked him, told him I forgot something, and that I'd be right back. I wasn't about to let him in to put the roses in water or anything, but we headed to the restaurant. We hadn't even ordered drinks when he dropped this bombshell on me. He told me he was 27, a virgin, and had never kissed anyone. This was his first date, and he was really nervous. And I'm sitting there thinking, really, dude, you know who else is really nervous now? Me. What was I supposed to do with that? Needless to say, dinner was awkward. I tried my best to be polite, but it just kept getting weirder. At the end of the night, he lunged toward me and stuck his tongue in and out of my mouth. Totally unexpected. But hey, he had his first date and kissed a real live girl, so good for him, I guess. I wasn't looking forward to telling him later that I wasn't interested and was moving, but I didn't want to ruin his moment then. Before I could break the news, though, things got even stranger. The next day, he started calling and leaving messages asking why I hadn't returned his calls. He said, "How dare you not return my calls?" And it wasn't even his business, but I had spent that weekend visiting family. When I got home, I found a full box of voice messages from him, and the last one was angry. When I went to work on Monday, I found a letter at my desk. The letter stated that he knew where I lived, what car I drove, and some other details that showed he'd been keeping track of my comings and goings. He wanted to know why I hadn't been home over the weekend, which, of course, was extremely creepy. I thought, this is why you're single, dude. He had gone from being awkward to downright stalkerish. I'd occasionally see him outside when I wasn't working, and eventually, I just decided to give my notice and leave. I thought that moving away would solve everything, but no, somehow he found me online. I don't use my real name because of work, but he managed to track me down, harassing me online, following my friends to find me, and acting aggressively. I just hope I can shake this guy soon because it's clearly taking a really bad turn. It started with the answering machine. I had bought an old landline phone at a thrift store, one of those clunky models with a built-in answering machine. I didn't need it, but something about it felt nostalgic, comforting. The first few days it worked fine. No missed calls. No messages. Then one night I saw the red light blinking. One new message. I hesitated. No one had the number. I hadn't given it out. I pressed play. At first there was only static. A soft hum, distant and hollow. Then beneath it, a voice, faint, whispering. "Can you hear me?" I shivered. The voice was distorted, layered in the static, but it was there, breathing. I deleted the message and unplugged the phone. I told myself it was interference, a wrong number, a glitch. But the next night, the red light was blinking again. Another message. I pressed play. More static, louder this time, pulsing like something alive. And then the voice. "I know you're listening." The air in the room turned thick, heavy. I grabbed the phone, yanked the cord from the wall, and threw it into a drawer. That night, I barely slept. At exactly 3:12 a.m., my cell phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it ring. My chest was tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then, a voicemail. I didn't want to listen, but something inside me, some terrible, sinking curiosity, forced my hand. The same static, the same voice. "You can't ignore me." The call ended with a sharp, ear-piercing screech, like nails dragging across metal. I threw my phone across the room. I stopped sleeping after that. I unplugged every phone in the house, blocked every unknown number. But the messages kept coming. Every night, exactly at 3:12 a.m. "I'm getting closer. Let me in. I remember you." I moved apartments, changed my number, got rid of every phone I owned. For a while it was quiet, until last night. I woke up to static. Not from a phone, not from a speaker, from inside the walls. And then the whisper. "You can't run forever." The red light on my unplugged answering machine blinked. One new message. I didn't listen to it. I packed my things, deciding to leave before sunrise. As I zipped up my bag, my phone vibrated in my pocket. No caller ID. I turned it off, shoving it deep into my bag. Then, as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. The static wasn't coming from inside the walls anymore. It was behind me. I turned slowly. The answering machine sat on the table, untouched. The red light blinked once. Then, in the dim glow of the streetlight outside, I saw something reflected in the darkened screen of the TV. A shape, standing right behind me. The voicemail played on its own. "Don't go. I'm already here." The static roared, and the lights went out.